forms are kind of in the middle of this picture. That's the final piece we're filling in. And forms are connected a lot of ways. Forms can be connected to models. They're used in the view and they're used in templates. And so they're a very powerful part. And all the things that we've been doing as abstractions, where we write a little bit of code and find lots of ways to reuse that code. Or we write some code that extends an object and then we add a little bit to it, and then we've got some very powerful object when we're all said and done. And so that's what we're doing here in forms. And forms can be used in views, they can be used in templates, and they can interact even with models. And so we're going to talk a lot about forms. There's a lot of like just menial labor that just working in forms, and if you really had to build all the HTML from scratch like I did in some of those earlier examples, it's just really painful. And there's other problems too, and that is that, you know, there's just a lot of repeating yourself. We kind of want to use like object-oriented techniques and other techniques to not repeat ourselves. And it's really easy to put the HTML up for a crappy form, but why wouldn't you want a beautiful form? And so if you write the HTML and you write some CSS and you do a kind of crappy version of it, then you have to fix it or hand it to a designer, and then they have to go fix 100 pages. There are things in Django, Crispy Forms is something we'll talk about later, that just like says, hey, I'm using forms in Django. Wait a sec, I want them to be pretty now. And then you just make them pretty. And if you want to change how they're pretty, you can change how that works. And then you change them all at the same time. And so not repeating yourself, being able to like lean on utility code. Seems like, why would we do this? But in complex applications, you just fall in love with this idea that you don't have to repeat yourself. And even though I've showed you some of the things like post, redirect, refresh, CSRF, all that stuff, it's even more complex than that, especially when you start talking about pulling data from the database and putting it in an edit form and then checking to see if the data is valid. If the data is not valid, send back an error form and give them a chance to resubmit it. If they're successful, you do post redirect and then you send a message in the session. We've done all that in really simple, but if you really look at everything that you need to look at, it's pretty complex. And so we're not going to do all this in this first lecture, but this gives you a sense of the kinds of things that a create form, where you're going to go like, you know, new cat, and then you got some forms to fill out, fields to fill out about the cat, and then you hit the save. And so if we just go through this, these are the steps you need to do to insert a cat in your cat database, right? So your browser initially goes and gets a GET request, and then you fill out the empty form with a bunch of fill in the blank fields. The user can always cancel out of that and get out. The user might enter some data and hit post. Now the problem is, what if you have some rules about the data, such as this is required, that has to be at least 5 characters, etc. You have to then send a form back with that data to let them fix it and resubmit it again. Or if it's good, you go ahead and store the data in the database, but then we have to put some kind of a success message, like in a session or something, and then send a redirect out, and then the browser immediately comes back and gets the redirect URL, which pulls the message out, sends the page, and sends the success. And so we've done parts of this already, right? We've done parts of this already. The big part we haven't done is kind of like this middle part here, where we're like validating the data and have this error retry loop that we put the user back in the loop and give them another chance. Now that's the create form. The edit process, where you're pulling in an existing cat and you're going to edit their fields, is even more complex. You know, you go load up a cat, but you might have an error page because they're looking for a cat that didn't exist in our database. You send out the form with the old data, they might leave, they might edit it, they might come back, they might validate the data and get an error, then they have to fix the data. They got to go around here until, okay, we got some valid data, and then you store the data in the database, put a message in a session, send out a redirect to a success URL, and that success URL, you put out the message and say yay. So that's complex too, and we're going to figure that out. Delete is not as simple as you might seem. The problem with deleting things is that you can't delete with a GET request. So usually you have to go navigate, like you see a little delete button, you click on it and you go to a delete page. It's going to load the data that you want to delete so you can build a confirmation page. Confirmation pages turn out to be really important because there also are a tricky way to convert a get to a post. But if they're asking for the wrong data, we have to send an error message. Otherwise, we send a confirmation form that says, are you sure you want to delete this? That's both nice for the user to give a confirmation, but it also then turns this into a form. And of course, they can leave with a cancel, but if they click on yes, that turns into a post, and it has the key. So the first thing it does is it has to load the data again from the model. And then if that data is not there, they got the wrong key, then you send an error page out. And if you got the right key and the user has permission to delete the data, then you go talk to the model and you delete the thing, right? Then you put a congratulations on your deletion in a session or something. Then go with a redirect, because you can't respond with a 200. You got to respond with a 302. And then the browser immediately does a get a success URL, pulls the message out of session, makes a success page with the message. Now we're going to cover this a bunch of times, so you don't have to get this the first time. But I just am telling you that forms are complex. And what's cool is Django form objects that we're going to create act like glue. They can generate the HTML, they allow for a consistent look and feel, and they allow for you to change the look and feel. When the post data comes back from the browser in a form that it created, then it puts it all in the right spot. It validates the data based on a set of rules that you say, like this has to be this kind of a thing and that kind of a thing, or a date or a character or an integer or a floating point. Whatever it is the rules are, that's all done for you in Django. And if something goes wrong, then it hands you an error form that you can send right back to the user. It really greatly, and then of course, once it's validated, it moves it into a model, and then actually can even do the database store automatically. So the form is like this glue thing that sort of talks to templates, it talks to browsers, it reads data from browsers, it's like stuff in. And so in a way, the form is like the controller, it's like the view, it just makes your views really succinct, and you're gonna love it once you understand it. So here is a simple form, and so forms live in a file called forms.py, not surprisingly. And basically, just like them, it looks a lot like the models file. And so you're going to see the one thing that forms do differently is they can have these things called validators. Models have rules about max length, etc. But there are even more complex validators, and you can even write code that you have your own functions that when the form is coming in, you're going to look at this one field and you're going to say like, oh, I wanted 2 uppercase characters followed by 3 lowercase characters. Sorry, you didn't do what I said. That's what's called a validator. And that's when that error page goes back and it says, hey, you're missing this stuff. And we'll show you how the validator stuff works. But basically, you put in little lines just like you did for the model. And you're effectively defining a user interface plus a bunch of logic behind it. Now, the one thing I'm not doing in this particular section, we'll do soon, is connecting this to a model. So you could say, wait a sec, I'd like to make a form and I really mostly want to inherit from a model. You can do that, but that's not this one. That's coming up in the whole next section, but it won't be long. So the form object, right? So here's this form we just made. It's got 3 fields in it. And this is a real simple view. It's not useful. It just kind of shows you one of the things you can do. So make a basic form. When the basic form is defined as having these 3 fields, and then you say form and then call the method as table. And so what this produces, it's just a dump. There's nothing, the UI of this looks really ugly, but basically it generates all this HTML for you, all this HTML, input tags, and we told it to do it as table. That's not necessarily the prettiest way to do it, but all that HTML is generated from the form utility. So it can send it out as a list, you can send it out as paragraphs, etc., etc., etc. And so this is just to show you kind of the dump. If you go to this URL, do a view source on it so you see this stuff in here. So that you define a form object, and one of the things you can do is make me HTML. And this is not a good example. We'll come up in a bit with a better example. The better example, of course, is to use it in a template. And so here is a template with a simple form in it. We got a form, it's a post. We got some submit stuff. We got ourselves a cancel, button that we put in, and we got a CSRF token, and we're going to use that form as table, and we're going to surround it by a table tag so that it looks a lot prettier. And so this is a far more typical way of doing it. That first one was just to dump it. And so this, when you do this and you give it, you sort of make the form in a get request, you make the form and you pass it into the context If you remember, form.asTable, that's a very, come back. You're too far. Form.asTable came from the context, came from the past in variable, and that is right here and right here. And so we make the form object, which has all the fields in it, and then we pass it into our view, our template, and it renders that. And so then this is what it looks like, much prettier. And if you do a view source of that, if you go to this form create and you do a view source on that, you'll see it's all that same table stuff. You know, it's the same table stuff that we had before. It's just now wrapped in some stuff to make it look a little prettier. We put a submit button, it's got a form tag, and then you can actually hit the submit button and something actually happens. So this is by far the more typical way of using a form in a template. So I talked about the create form, the update form, and the delete form. This is kind of an example of how forms can be used. Now, I'm not actually talking in the model yet. We'll do that in a bit. So I'm just going to pretend that we have some old data. And so this normally would come from the model. This old data, title, mileage, purchase date, that would come from the model normally. But for now, we're just going to like make it up. And so then you basically start a form and you pass this old data in as the constructor. That's a constructor for a basic form. From the basic form class, pass in old data and give me back the form. Give me back an object of type basic form, and I'm going to have it in the variable form, and then I'm going to pass it into context. Now you'll notice I'm using the exact same template, the one I showed you before, because that form as table understands that sometimes there's data in these fields, and it properly puts the data in. It properly escapes the data. It understands that this is a number. It understands that this is a date. It's got all that stuff all figured out, right? And so this is how it works, is you just somehow get your hands on key value pairs of the old data, you pass it into the constructor, and now you render the form, and the forms library takes care of putting in all that old data. Believe you me, you're probably glad I'm not showing you how to do, you know, HTML and code and all these things, and when you do encode, but this is a little different because it's inside of an attribute. You don't want to know that because you just are going to use form as table, and it's got all the rules figured out. And this is hundreds of lines of code that you're not writing. So up next we're going to talk about the validation part. So that's actually what happens when we receive data back from the browser. Hello and welcome to another Django for Everybody walkthrough. So you are probably at this point working on your autos assignment. This is our first real create, read, update, and delete assignment. And we're going to, a lot of what this assignment is to look at the code I've given you in DJ Free Samples and pull it in. Do not clone the repository for this assignment. The DJ Free Samples is a monster. It's got all kinds of stuff in it that's way too complex. And you do not want, you want to start with a nice clean application. Your previous assignment was to make a really tiny application. Now we're going to extend that application, and that's why you've already have this DJ for E projects in your wherever it is, okay? And so what this is this assignment is to evolve that using the sample code. But what I'm really going to do is I'm going to walk through the sample code because there's new concepts in this sample code. So this is more of a lecture about the sample code than exactly how to do the assignment. But importantly, you need to understand every single line, because literally every program that we're going to write for the next N weeks is a variation on this CRUD, right? And so these views, these default views, the get or 404, all that stuff are really foundational things. And what we're going to find is the right way to write this code, like everything in Django, is really small and succinct. Okay? So let's take a look at the code. Let's go ahead and run the code. Go to autos, and you got to log in. And so the idea of this is there are two tables. There is a table of makes. So I'm going to add a make, and then I'm going to add an auto. And the cool thing about this is neon 1, mileage 1, 2, 3, 4, Sakai car. And then I have this cool drop down. And so this is there's a whole bunch of forms going on here. There's drop downs. There's a many-to-one relationship going on. Then I have this list, and I can update it and delete it. So that's where our full CRUD is. And so we can add makes, view makes, add autos, etc. And so that's all the sample. So it's very close to what it is that you have to write. It's just don't go grabbing all that stuff. So let's start by taking a look. So I'm here sitting in my DJ free samples. And if you look, you see all of my various applications under a project. And so we've got the autos, but I really want to start with the authentication code. The code that, if I go here, back to samples, let me log out, the code that allows me to log in. So if I go straight to autos, see if I've logged out. Right, so you'll notice that what it does when I go straight to autos is it routes me to login, and then with the next to go back to autos. So this view in autos, the /autos, has protected itself with login mixin. And later we'll do login. Your login won't quite look like this, but this is the one I have on samples where you don't have to make it pretty yet. An upcoming assignment is going to make everything pretty. So now we're at autos and we're logged in. Okay, and your application has to have some more things here, but I'm more interested in showing you really the essence of the views in this autos, right? So if we let's just review just briefly. Let's just review briefly about how the auto login works, right? So if I look at DJ free samples /settings.py, you need to have this auth plugged in, right? So that basically that's a bunch of code, some views, etc. that comes from Django, and that's been there all along when you did your start project. Of course, then somewhere in here we've got to have the autos, wherever autos is. Yeah, autos app config. You get to pull the autos app in. And if I take a look at DJ free samples /urls.py, then I can find autos here. And there needs to be some kind of a link that basically says at the top level, everything below autos is delegated to the URLs file in autos.py. But also then there is the accounts, right? And so if you recall, this is a bunch of views that come from Django for us. It's pre-installed for us. And the thing that we've got to do is we've got to build we've got to provide this a template with the name registration.html. So I think I've got this in home /templates registration. Yes, I do. So I've got actually two logins. I've got a really simple one is login.html, and this is the one I recommend that you start with. Later we'll use the social login. And this is very simple. It's a login page. It uses the Django Forms capability. If form.errors, that means that there was a validation error and it came back and redisplayed this page and showed you an error. And then we make a simple post form with a URL that is a reverse lookup to a view with the name of login. Then we put the CSRF token in, and then we take the form, and I'm just making this with paragraph tags. And so that's a simple login. That's not the actual one that we're showing. And then the next is a hidden value that you've got to pass in so that when you actually successfully log in, it knows to come back to autos when it's all done. It comes back here after the login has been done. And so that registration/login, you can put this in any of your applications, but you want to name it registration/login.html. So if I take a look real quick and I go into home templates, these are all the templates. When I do an ls, you'll see that I have a home templates home and a home templates registration. You can have more than one folder here. And if I do look at what's in registration, you see that I've got this simple login and then later the more complex login that will give us the GitHub login capabilities. So we can log in using, what that means is login use social. The point is underneath this templates, you don't have to just have one subfolder. You can have more than one subfolders. And so that is the necessary configuration to make it so that when we tell our views to add the login mixin, which we'll see in just a second, when we tell our views in the login to use the login mixin, then it knows where to get the template from. So that's just part of it.
And your instructions tell you how to do that. So any application that you're going to build or any project you're going to build, you have to put those in settings.py, urls.py, and then make the template. And then you have to start using log and mixin, and then everything just magically starts coming together. So let's take a look at the actual autos application. We'll look at a couple of different things here. Autos slash URLs. And I'm going to do a I'm going to tab so I can switch back between files really fast. You probably have a better text editor than me. So I've got URLs. I'm going to take a look at the views. Nope. Autos. Views.py. Then I'm going to look at autos model.py. Models.py. And then I'm going to look at autos forms.py. And so let's sort of work through these 4 files: URLs, views, models, forms. Probably let's do models first. So this is pretty straightforward. We're going to make a make object class. It's going to have 1 character field with some validators in it. We kind of played with that with forms. You can put validators in models. We've previously seen validators in form, but there's a validator that basically says we're not going to accept data coming into this database table unless there's at least 2 characters. These underscore str, you've been doing this for a while. That basically is if you take a model object, an actual make, and you print it, it says which of the fields, in this case there's only 1 field, and so that just says when we're converting a model to a string, a model object to a string, we get to decide how that looks. Okay, and then we have an automobile, and it's got a nickname with a min-length validator, max length of 200, a mileage, which is an integer field, a comments, which is a 300-character field, and then a foreign key into, this is a one-to-many or many-to-one relationship, not a many-to-many, just a foreign key into make, and then we're going to do on-delete cascade, which really means if you delete a make, then the corresponding auto entries will automatically be deleted. And so this is a pretty straightforward model, actually very, very simple. And once again, we're always defining this stir __ self so that we know that we're just, if you're just showing it like in the admin interface, or if you're just printing it, or just converting the model itself to a string, the field among these fields that is supposed to be used is the nickname field, just to show to end users. So that's the models file. Let's look at the forms file next. So the forms file is interesting because we've seen forms that are just forms by themselves, but this is a special kind of form in that it's a model form. In that we normally, in the other models, we had all these fields, right? And we put them in, and it looked a lot like a model file where we'd have a character field, a positive integer field. But what we're basically saying is, you know what? We're going to make a form here. And really, all we want to do is take all the fields from the make model and make them form fields. So a form and a model are 2 different things. A form is something that goes between sort of the view and the template. And as you'll see, it also goes down into the models automatically, but you gotta, so this is just like make all the fields, right? Let's make a form, because form objects don't have to be associated with models, but in this case, we're going to sort of derive a form object from a model. And so instead of extending form, we're extending model form. So that's a model form must have, and this is just some data that says the model that we're going to pull all our fields from is the make model. And it only has one thing, which is a name. That's it. Okay, so this is auto-generating a form that if we changed it and added another field here, then this make form would automatically have a field. You can give it a list of fields, __ all __ is like a signal to say, just give me all of them. Now there might be some internal things like created at or updated at or something that you don't want to use. So that's a form. Remember how forms work. Covered that before. Let's take a look at our URLs. Now a lot of this looks pretty similar to things that we've done, right? We basically have a main table, which is our autos table, and our lookup table, which is our makes table. and we have sort of three things. There is the main list view, which is list all the autos. There is the main the make list view, which is list all the makes. And then we can make a new one, which doesn't have a primary key, because part of the idea is the create is making a new thing, which is going to generate a primary key. And then we're going to have a update and a delete. And so we have a read, a create, update, delete. So it's not exactly CRUD, but you see all four of these things. And so we've got views, and we name these views so that we can reference them in our views themselves and in our templates, so we can make links in between them. Okay? Okay, so these are pretty straightforward and not all that different. So the fun starts to happen when we're in the views.py. So login mixin, if you remember from the auth-z walkthrough, you just add this to a view, and it just basically says you cannot get to this view unless you're logged in, and if you aren't logged in, it will bounce to the login.html file and then bounce back after you're done. And so login required mixin is all we need to do. If you go to the auth-z sample, you'll see like I did that by hand, but you don't want to do it by hand. You just call login mixin. Now, so this main view is a list view, and so let's go take a look at what this is going to look like. This is the list view. So we're going to take however many autos we have, we're going to loop through that list, we're going to retrieve all the autos from the database, then we're going to have an add the auto link, then a view the makes link with a count of how many makes there are, and add a make. So let me also then go into autos templates, autos again, yeah, I'm sorry about that, and auto list. So this is the template that makes that. And so there's a few things that we get. We get an auto list. Now the names of these are not forced upon you, but there's conventions that turn out in a moment. They're going to look really useful. Okay. So we're going to get an auto list. And if we go back into our views, we see that we say get all of the objects from the auto table, all the auto class objects, retrieve them all, pass them in to the context as auto_list. Now we also want to be able to show that little count, this number 2. So we're going to ask, go ahead to the make objects all, but don't give me a list of them, count them and give just me a number, give me a number. So make count is stuck in there, and you'll see if make count is greater than 0, we can show the add an auto button, and it also somewhere, yeah, shows the make count, view all the makes, add a make, and the make count comes out here. So that's another thing we put in. The auto list we're going to go through, and that iteration variable of auto is going to go through each of the separate things, and nickname, make, etc. That's right straight out of the models.py file. There's the 4 things that every auto has, and we're just printing all this stuff out. You also get the primary key, and so we're going to make a update URL, and that URL is to auto update. So if we look in urls.py, we see this auto update looks up, this gives us a path to the view, but that particular path needs one parameter, which is a primary key, and so that means that this URL template tag autos has to have the auto ID. But because we're looping through the models, you got one, right? So, and you do an auto create, that's pretty straightforward. But one of the rules is you have to have at least one make before you can do an auto, because if you recall, add an auto has to have this drop-down list populatable, and that's being pulled from the make table, okay? And so that's basically the way around this. That's the main view. Now, just like I showed you before, it turns out that there are here we go. Auto create update. Yeah, that's the autos view. So, and then if we do the make view, we're doing the same kind of thing. If we go and look at the make list, we're doing the same basic kind of thing. View all the makes. This is the, and now we got update and delete. We are, this way you don't need a count. We just want to grab all of the objects. We want to put it in a context under make list, and then we do make list under HTML, and this is even simpler. It's just going through the make list. It comes in through the context. If there's none, we don't print this out, and then we put out the name of it, and then we have an update and a delete button that goes to the update and delete. And of course, those, if you look in urls.py, those also, the update and delete, have primary key requirements. And so you have a primary key that you got to pass in here to make that URL the proper kind of URL. And then just some links to go back to the various things so that we can, get back to autos, view makes, add a new make, cancel, all that stuff. Okay? So that is the views.py for listing the autos and the makes. Okay? Now, we want to make the make create view. Okay? So if we take a look at the make create view, that is add a make. That's going to create this form. I can make this bigger here. Create this form where you're going to put in a thing called Chevy VY. So we need a way to make this form, right? And so we're going to make it a login required. We're not going to let folks do this. We're going to have some variables that are class-wide, like what template we want to use. And success URL is after we have done this right. Now, if you just submit it and it complains, it doesn't do it. But once you've done it right, where do you want to go afterwards? So Chevy. Where do you want to go afterwards? This is a controller function. Boom. I want to go back to the auto list. And so the success URL is go to autos:all, which in urls.py is this main view. That's the name of the main view. Okay? And so if we go here, which template to use and which success URL. If we do a get request, we're going to build a form for the make. That comes from make form, but really it comes from the make model, which is just one string field. It's simple as that, right? We're reusing this. We're just saying, let's make a form that pulls from here. We have to pass a form in because models can't be used to create this kind of a screen. That screen comes from a form, okay? And so if we take a look at the template, oops. If we look at the make create template, make form. So that is, that's the template we're going to use to make form. We're going to need form as table, right? So that's from how we did forms. Put the CSRF token, you make a table, that could be as paragraphs or as tables, but whatever, you need this form object. So you need to pass the form object in. And so here we are. We're going to make a form, and then we're going to pass the form object in, and then we're going to render it at self.template, autos.makeForm, HTML. And then we're going to return that for the get. And then when we hit the button, the submit button, add a make, we hit the submit button, it's going to do, it's coming into the post because we made a form post, comes in. We're going to take the, oop, don't do that. Oh, that's terrible. I hate it when VI does that. But here we go, we're back. Yeah. So, post comes in, request.post has all the key value pairs, which are these key value pairs as defined by the form. So we say, let's make a make form with the initial data coming in from request post. And given that the form generated it, it knows what the names of these fields are, and this is something that hides behind how forms work. But it also checks to see if the form data is valid. And that means, were all these validator rules followed? If the validator rules are not followed, if not form is valid, we're just going to send it back. And so so this code here, this if form is not valid code, if I put in a single letter at A and hit submit, it's going to come back and re-render the form, and all that error stuff, all that stuff is all handled by this form code. This Django form code figures out what is wrong. Right, let me move this over just a little bit so I can get back to it faster. There we go. It figures out what's wrong with it, makes an error message. The error message came from models.py right here. Oh no, right here. And then went through forms.py because it is a form ultimately that we inherited from model form. Get it? And so that's cool. So that's the error condition. And otherwise we do form.save. Now the thing here is that's really super cool is because this form is a model form. It knows this, and the field names are the same as the field names in the model. And so it actually does a save on the model itself. So in a way, the form contains the model data that came from the post request, and then it saves it. Okay? That saves the form. It puts it in. And then we just redirect back to the request URL. So this is pretty succinct, right? We pull in the post data. We check to see if it's bad. If it's bad, we send it back, send the form back to the exact same template we did, and then we save it if it's good, and then we pop to the success URL. That is a beautiful thing. But just like in Django all the time, this is a far wordier thing to do, even though this is super succinct. And if you did this in almost any other language, you'd be like, 75 lines of code. And here we have like 15 lines of code. But it turns out in Django, there's almost always a more succinct way to do it. We have a generic create view. You can take a look at the documentation for this generic create view. Django views generic edit. Let's just go and Google this stuff. I always just put a dot here, and this usually gets me right to, because that's the actual package and the class inside the package. Oh no, sorry. It thought that was a domain name, so the search didn't work. But now I'll just say, Django something. Look like, so at least it's going to do the search for me. Generic editing views, jump to the create view. So you can read through all this stuff, right? Generic create view. Actually, let's do I have a reference to this? So there you go. Take a look at that. Now, this, just like some of the other views that we've inherited, have a ton of functionality in them. So if I want to do an auto create, this is all it takes. Now, auto create and make create, for all intents and purposes, do the exact same thing. So what happens in auto create, because we're extending create view, we have 3 bits of metadata. We tell it which model we want to use, which fields from that model we want, and where the success URL to go is. And then this generates all this code. We inherited all that code. You'll notice that there's nothing hard-coded in here except the make form. Now, we don't even have to make a form for the auto, because this code right here builds the form. And not only that, but it uses this name auto to pick the template. So if I do auto underscore form, I have to use this, right? I use this, that's my base bootstrap. Don't worry too much about that. And so it knows the name of the template that it's going to use. I don't even have to tell it which template to use in here, because it derives the template. Auto underscore form.html is the template. Pretty cool, huh? Pretty awesome and cool. So it automatically finds that and the success URL. And so this is all that's needed. As a matter of fact, I could, in this make create, I could have deleted all this code from here to here, but instead just do a create view by extending create view. So I'm just showing you this because I want you to see what's really going on. But this is not how you write your code. This is how you write your code. Okay? So now I want to show you the hard way of doing an update. So what's an update? Let's take a look at the code. So let's take a look at view makes. Update is the thing that happens when we go here, and that's going to go to make update. So here's make update. Here's urls.py. It's this one. Lookup primary key update, which then if you look under here, it's going to be autos lookup one update, right? So I'm going to update the Chevy one. It has to read the old data, has to show it to you, and then let us update it, and then submit it, checking, of course, for any validation errors, and then redirecting us back to a success URL. So if we look at the views, we're going to, again, foreshadowing, there's a much easier way to do this. So we set these variables, where the success URL, which template we want, and the model, okay? And then we have a GET request, and because in the urls.py, there's this int pk, we're passed in this pk value. Now, this get object or 404 is really cool, okay? So self.model, this get object 404, self.model pk equals pk. That's this parameter, but we're passing pk equals, and it's common that they are the same name, but this is a parameter to get object or 404. The second one is the parameter that was called to our get. Self.model, of course, is make, right? And get object or 404 basically checks to see if, so I'll do this update. Let's go to makes. Let's do an update. And what it's doing is it's taking this number, this 3 here, autos lookup 3 update, and it's retrieving the old data. Now, what happens if I inadvertently have a number that doesn't exist in the database, like 9,999, and I do a GET request to that one, I get page not found 404, right? And so what's happening here is somehow you say, hey, load this object and give it to me in the variable make, or just blow up and send out a 404 error, right? And so this is telling you what's going on, which view you just know make matches the given query. Now, generally, you're not supposed to hand type these. 3 works, and so it doesn't blow up. So get object or 404 is a way of loading the old data and then protecting, and using that data or just blowing up. So don't go any farther at that point. Now, then we're going to make a form and we're going to fill it with the old data. So the instance is make. So that's the object. Make a make form. Here's a make form. All the fields from the model inherit from the model make. And then pass it into the template make form.html, which we just looked at. This form comes in. That's all we need. This is very generic looking. It really doesn't care too much. It's all pretty much encoded in this form, which is derived from the model. Then, of course, we type a bunch of stuff in, blah, 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 and we hit submit, and it does exactly the same thing as the create, in that it does, well, first it has to do a get or 404 because we post to the thing that with the primary key. We load it up to make sure we have an object to update. Then we create a new make form from that database and then change it. So this is the starting data, but then it alters it to the data. So in this particular case, Chevrolet is the old value in the database, and if I say bow tie request post will have bow tie. This will start as Chevrolet, but in this form object, then it will be bow tie. Of course, if it's not valid, we're going to return an error message right back here. And if it is valid, we're going to save it. And so this new bow tie is going to be saved in there. And so if we view our makes, we see that it's now bow tie, right? And we're going to redirect to success URL. Now, at this point, I would hope you could predict about what's going to happen next. Auto update extends update view, the generic editing view. It says which model it is, which fields you want, and where to go when it's successful. Okay? And then it does everything that's in here, right? It does everything that's in here. And literally I could go and say the exact same words for make delete, which is what happens when you go in here and you delete, and then you have a cancel. There's a there is a confirm delete, and the name of this template is not randomly chosen. It's got to be called the confirm delete, the model confirm delete, right? And there you go. You got a CSRF token. You're handed the make as an object in this, so that produces this output. There's no form in this one. There's just the make that gets loaded by object or 404, and then it passes make in and renders it, and then when the post happens, it retrieves it. If it's there, with a 404, again checking for bad data and deleting it, and then hopping off to the success URL. And it doesn't take much to guess what I'm going to do next, and that is if you extend delete view, you get all that code for free. You just tell which model, fields, and where to go for success. And so the key thing is as you're doing your homework, I'm sure some of you are just going to like copy and paste all this stuff. That's wrong. This make create, the make update, and the make delete should be as short as auto create, auto update, and auto delete, because you're going to do this a lot, right? You're going to do these generic editing views a lot, and we're going to do CRUD over and over and over again, and you really do not want to write 15 lines of code. That's unnecessary repetition, unnecessary cutting and pasting and changing code, if you can keep it really simple. So I can basically build a full set of CRUD forms and CRUD functionality with validation for a model with this kind of code. And then I don't even have to have a forms.py, I just have a models.py. So if you're doing your autos, you kind of would think, I made a mistake if I'm making a forms.py. Because if I just use this views.py this way, instead of making all of them look like make update, then you're going to save yourself a lot of time and energy. And when you have to modify these things, it's a lot easier to find all the changes and then modify them. So that is a walkthrough of the sample code for autos. And you're going to do an assignment on this, but don't just copy everything. I set this up so that the time you spend understanding what's going on, particularly in the views, right? URLs you'll probably just copy. Models you just copy. The URLs you'll just copy. But the views, don't just copy it. Figure out what's really going on and come up with the easier and more succinct way to do all this stuff, okay? Because Django is starting to look really beautiful at this point. So I hope you found this helpful. Cheers.
So now we're going to talk about data validation. Data validation is what happens when you hit the submit button and then that data is sent to the server. And what the server does is it checks that post data that it's getting to see if it's proper according to its rules. So if you go back to this picture I showed you in the create form, the part we're talking about now is really this part right here, where the user has entered their data, they've hit the submit button, and we in the server are going to look at that data. And then we are going to decide if it's an error, send back a form, or store the data. And we're actually sort of just have a comment say store the data, and then go to the success. So we're really looking at this part right here of receiving and validating the data and then taking all those actions. Okay. So the idea of data errors is, you're typing in a form and you forget your zip code and you hit the button and a little red box pops up and says zip code is required. Now you can also tell the fields in the browser that they're required so that the browser won't even send the data. That's different, and not all browsers do that. So you still have to check if you really want the zip code. You got to check to make sure the zip code is there. Now in this one, I made it just to generate errors. I made a validator on that form, if you recall, that said that all the titles have to be at least 2 characters. And here's a little message: please enter 2 or more characters if that's not true. Because otherwise, the fact that it's not a string or a number or whatever, because the browser is a little too smart for us. So I had to come up with a validator that would fail in the server and not fail in the browser. You still need to validate data in the server. So you type some stuff in, you make a mistake, like in this case, the title was only 1 letter. I hit the submit button, and now what I want to see is a thing that tells me what the errors are and gives me a chance to fix it, including putting the old data that I just posted, right? So it gives me my post data back. And then I get a chance to resubmit. So again, here's the data form, and the validator there it's a min-length validator. If you go look at the documentation, there's a jillion validators. This was really simple and it fits on a slide. So basically, in addition to whatever the fact that it's got to be a character field, I want it to be at least 2 characters. And that's not a crazy validator to have, because you might have a post that says, look, you're not going to have a title of 1 character when you're doing a blog post or something like that, right? You might say, look, at least 5 characters. So now we're going to walk through that process. And so if you take a look at this code from the form, in comes a GET request, and that GET request is going to show up with some old data. It's going to create the form with the initial settings. It's going to build a context that it's going to pass into the render. Same render form that just makes the thing with the table tags and CSRF and form post. And so at this point, we are a GET request. We are returning a 200, which is returning the HTML for that page, right? So that's the first part of it. And that is in the edit process, get the old data, show it to the user, and give the user an opportunity to change the data. So now we change the data, right? And let's just say we didn't make any mistakes. You changed a few numbers, you hit the post, which gathers up all this stuff and sends it as a post request to the server. So then what happens is it comes into the post method. See how these class-based views are so dang pretty, right? So pretty. And so request post, right? All that data coming from the form comes into request post, and you just construct the basic form and say, hey, basic form, your old data is from the post, and all the fields are named the right way, and the key value pairs. I mean, this is basically a dictionary, but the form made the key value pairs. It knew what names to name all the forms, so it named them, and so it's not surprising. It knows exactly what to expect in there, right? And so it takes a look at the post data, and then it constructs us a form object, right? It constructs us a form object and basically says, if there was a validation failure, if not form is valid, then we're going to do one thing. But in this case, I didn't make any changes, so form is valid, so it drops down. This is where we would normally store the data off to the model, but I'm keeping this really simple. And then I'm going to redirect with a 302 to form success. The other thing I might do is put a message in the session so that the message makes it into here, but I'm keeping it simple. And the browser immediately comes back and does a get to /form/success, and then I return thank you very much. I might have pulled a message out, as we've seen in an example where I have, from the post method to the next get, I drop a flash message into something. But there's better ways to do that, and I'll show you that in an upcoming lecture series. And so that's the success flow, and it works great. Now, let's take a look at what goes wrong. So in this case, I got my form, I put in the wrong kind of title, it's too short, I send a post, it gathers up all this data, sends it along with the post, that comes in request.post. And so now, the form comes back, and now form is valid as false. because I violated a rule. Now the interesting thing is, in this form object is not only the old data, but also all the error messages, because at this moment it has constructed a form object, and part of the form object is error messages. Okay? So if it's not valid, let's make a little context. Okay? Let's make a little context and pass that in, and then out it comes, and at that point, that form as table is going to print out all of this stuff. All those error messages come back. So I render it back. Now, I render it back, and then of course you can submit it and maybe get to a success. Now there is one sort of interesting question about this page, which I have asked a Stack Overflow question about, and I'm not sure I'm ecstatically happy about it. And that is, this pattern is exactly how Django wants you to write it. It wants you to write this. And if you'll notice, I'm doing something I told you not to do. Django is telling me to do something that I don't want to do, and that is return a 200 at the result of a post. So I got a post. Now the key thing is, the thing that everyone will agree on is, once you store data, you have to return a redirect. And so the Django people who've done this for years, they consider it okay to return the 200 and a page after a post if no data was changed. Now the problem is, if you hit refresh on this, you're going to get the weird funky message. But this is how Django works. And so I don't know what to tell you. I can write my forms differently. It's a few more lines of code in here, and I've written that, and I've made it so that I pass the error message and I serialize the form and put it in the session and do something. But I'm not going to fight City Hall on that one. I'm just going to say, if Django thinks it's fine, the thing we do agree on is, if you're going to return a 200, don't return a 200 after you've saved data, because then you'll double save the data. Like, you'll double commit a transaction, you'll double do a transfer, you'll double order, you'll do whatever. But in this case, all we did is looked at the data, came back, and then sent back an error message. So you can look at the Stack Overflow where I sort of argue for a little bit. So this has been a long lecture series. We talked about HTML, we talked about HTTP, how get and post are different ways of doing it. We've talked about the idea of how to fix the refresh. We talked about cross-site request forgery, CSRF, and how Django handles CSRF. And then toward the end here, we've talked about how to define forms in Django to sort of outsource all that HTML generation, and how we do validation. Now, there's much more to learn on this, and we're going to learn more of the features of form objects as we go forward and build increasingly complex applications.
Hello and welcome to our tutorial on the Hello World application for Django for Everybody. So I am going to go in excruciating detail how I have this Hello World, how this comes out at drchuck.pythonanywhere.com. And now, if you go to this website, you never know what you're going to see, because I have lots of Django projects that I can mount up on this URL, and I'll show you how that's all done. So, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to wake up my Python, just my Python for Everywhere, Python Anywhere dashboard, and walk through a couple of things. So I want to call your attention here to my left-hand side here. So you see that I've got a bash console and a bash console in the virtual environment Django 2. It's probably a good time to review what a virtual environment is. If you go back to your old installing Django on Python Anywhere, I have this assignment, and if you go back to this assignment, that's paw_install_md under the ASSN folder, you had this thing make virtual environment, pip3 install Django, and then work on Django, and then we would do Python 3 -m Django -- version. And at some point it showed you the Django version. And if you recall, this took some bit of a long time. And virtual environments are a way in Python for you to change the overall Python configuration and install things that the owner of this computer has not installed themselves. So, so Python Anywhere, they installed a version of Python, they may have installed Django, they may or may not have installed Django extensions, etc. And so you want to have more control over what bits of software are actually running in your environment. So instead of using a system-wide Python, you're going to use your own environment, and that's what a virtual environment is. And so this is creating files in your home directory, and if you go in under Files, so I'll go in under the Files tab of Python Anywhere. If you see it in your home directory, you see .virtualenvs, and if you go in, you see one folder called Django 2. And that actually has lots of stuff. You don't want to include, you don't want to mess with this. That virtual env Django 2, .virtualenvs Django 2, that was created by you when you ran make virtual environment, and it downloaded a bunch of stuff. And then in that you could run the pip3 command, which is installing extensions to Python. Now on your laptop, you might be able to just run pip3 normally, and just install more stuff once you have it configured properly. But now we're on a shared system at Python Anywhere, so we have to do virtual environments. You can do virtual environments in your laptop as well. It's nice if you do it, but it's not essential. Sometimes you can just run pip yourself and have the system-wide Python get all your stuff. But sometimes your laptop can get messed up because systems like Anaconda or Miniconda really confuse your Python, and that's unfortunately because there are so many ways to install and reconfigure Python on your laptop that can get you in trouble. But in this Linux arrangement that we have with Python Anywhere, it's actually pretty easy. You make a virtual environment, it works pretty good. Now, every time you leave and make a new shell, you have to say work on Django 2, otherwise you've inherited the standard things. And so if I take a look at my dashboard, and you see I've got a bash console, and then I've got a bash console in the virtual environment named Django 2. And so if I click on the bash console alone, you see I don't have the work on the Django 2 prompt. Should be a sign that something's not going to work for you. And what you can do is you can always just say work on Django 2. And that says for the rest of this session, until that bash console goes away, I want to be using the Python that is part of my virtual environment. Now there's a command in Linux called which. So I'm going to say which Python. Well, now it might actually, this one might python3. So you'll see which tells me if I type the command python3, which python3 says, if I type the command python3, where's it going to load that code from? And you see that which python3 is going from the virtual environment, meaning I have installed a copy of Python3 in my home directory, and that's the one I'm using when I type Python3. And that's the essence of how this virtual environment works. So I'm going to log out of this shell. Okay, exit. We'll just exit. Okay, so now if I go back to the dashboard, I should only, so I have this one here. I'm not going to click on the bash console and virtual env yet. I'm just going to start a new console, and that'll start one up, and I won't be in the virtual environment. So that's the key. Every time you start a new one, you see I'm not in the virtual environment because it doesn't say Django. If I type which python3, that is my own local copy of Python3, and I don't quite know how that works, but it's not the system one, but I'm going to guess that is not one that's in my virtual environment. But there's other parts that of the virtual environment that are important. So that just shows you that. I'm going to exit out of here using Control D, and that's going to close this. Now I can go back to my dashboard. Now, there's a really cool thing that you can do to make sure you're always in a virtual environment. And I do this all the time, almost without thinking. So I'm going to go under my Web tab in Python Anywhere. And if you scroll down, one of the things you were supposed to set up is this virtual env area. And I've got that path, the exact home drchuck.virtualenvs Django 2. That's got to be in there, or my online web application is not going to run and start. Okay? But I can also then start a console in that virtual environment. And that's how I created that console. And if I click on this, start a console in the virtual environment, it actually starts it and then does the work on for me automatically. And you see that I've got Django 2 here automatically. And so that means that sort of all my Python Anywhere stuff works. You'll notice I'm actually properly in the folder for my Django project. And that Django project is the one that's currently mounted into my, I'm going to exit out of here. And so close this, go back to the web tab. And so back to the web tab, there are these variables, source code, working directory, WSGI configuration file. Those are telling the Python Anywhere which of the Django projects am I really mounting at this point. And we'll talk about these later. These three files allow me to have in my home directory on Python Anywhere a whole bunch of different projects and let me switch between them. The local library project, the Hello project, the DJ Free project, the my setup. And so this is how you switch it. Of course, whenever you switch these things, you've got to do the reload, right? So that's sort of my summary of virtual environments. And so I would say, ultimately, don't try to reinstall your virtual environments, right? I would install it once, and chances are good, if you did it right, your virtual environment is not broken. What is most likely broken is the fact that you're not using the virtual environment. So a lot of people are like, oh, I'm going to blast this virtual environment, trash it, and try to go all the way back to the install. Sometimes you might have to do that, right? But it kind of confuses your system if you are like running in the virtual environment and you wipe out the virtual environment, you try to remake the virtual environment, and it doesn't work so well. So just in general, once you get the virtual environment set up, leave it alone. Don't try to fix it. It's probably okay. Start a shell, say work on Django 2, and if it doesn't blow up, you're probably okay. Okay, so that's a quick review of what we have with virtual environments. And remember, this is PAW_install MD is the place where we set that up. But at this point, it's some time ago. Okay? So now that we've done all this, I'm going to go into my web tab, and from previous times I've got this virtual environment. When you switch applications or switch Django projects, you don't switch the virtual environment. That stays the same. That's just giving you Django and Python and all the Python extensions, the Django extensions that we've added. So I'm going to go ahead and start a console. Hopefully I'm not running out of them. I keep exiting them so I don't run out of them. So I'm happy at the point where I've got a bash console and it's in the right folder and it's working in the Django 2 virtual environment. So you see that. I'm working in the Django 2 virtual environment. I'm in /Django_project/first. Now, I'm going to say cd ... to go up a folder. And so this folder is Django projects. If you're using GitHub, this is what you check into GitHub. And so this has all the work I've done so far in this course. I've got my test site, which was the very first assignment, then local library, which was all those whole series of assignments where we're making books and authors and all that stuff, and that code's all sitting here in local library. My folder's called Django projects because each one of these is a different Django project. Checklist is something we're going to build later. DJ Free is what you're building, hopefully, about right now. But I didn't name it because I had this thing called First, which is, I should probably call this the beginning. But First is this application that you're building from scratch at this point in this kind of DIY hello world. So First, I made First by using a Django admin start app, and let's go to that, the Hello World page. Hello World. So, right, Django admin start projects DJ for E. That's going to make a subfolder within Django projects. You got to say work on Django 2 if you need it. But if Django 2 is already showing in your prompt, and you don't have to keep saying that over and over again. And then you're going to start an application within that. So I've gone down one folder into Django projects DJ for E. I ran Python 3 manage.py start app home. And so if I take a look at the folders, I've got database. I've got First folder, which is the name for the Django project. That's for settings.py and urls.py for the entire project. And then I have one application called home. And we'll talk about that in a second. And that is the sort of first application. And home is actually where the template that renders hello world is going to be shown. And so that's that's all good. And so I'm in project first, and I've done this other than I didn't name it DJ Free, I named it project first. Okay, now I say how to start Django new project if you're on a local computer. You're not on a local computer. You are in Python Anywhere. So let's take a look at some of the files and the important things. And again, the instructions tell you how to edit these files. Or let's just file the outline of the homework assignment. So let's go into, I'm going to open this in a new window, the Web tab. Now, the Web tab is really cool. There's a reload, although you'll see that there's little reload buttons all over the place. If there's a little reload, there's not one here. I wish there was in the console, but there isn't. But reloading it is when you make changes, okay? So the key thing here is this code section. And there's source code, working directory, WSGI configuration file. Again, I said don't change virtual envs. And then there's this error log down here under log files, Dr. Chuck Python Anywhere.com error log. If you get the dreaded something went wrong with a smiley face, then you have to go look in this error log and scroll all the way to the bottom. But back to code and source code. So the working directory and source code are two of the three things you have to switch when you're going from one project to the other. And that is just the full path of the source code directory and the working directory. Working directory tells it how to find the db.sqlite file, right? So that is the file. And there's going to be many db.sqlite files under Django projects, one for each of the Django projects that I build. And that's where migrations, and so in every folder under Django projects, there is, here, let me go, cd ... I'm going to say ls-l star, that means in all folders, /db.sqlite3. And you see that there are a number of db.sqlite3s. And so it's important in the web app setup, I'll go back into first, cd first. It's important in the web app setup that you tell it where to go to get the db.sqlite3 file. You just edit this and you change it. Now, pretty much all this is the same, except the last part where it says first, and then you're going to change that. Now, you'll notice the path to the WSGI configuration file is not in your home folder at all. And so you just have to edit this. This is kind of in the system far, far outside your control, but it is the way that you tell the Django starter upper code that's part of Python Anywhere how to start your code up. And so here you generally have to get this path right, the OS path expand user tilde, which is my home directory, /Django project /first. That basically is the path to the Django project. And then you have to say first.settings. That has to do with the fact that this is the first module gets imported, and that's a object within the first module rather than a file path. So that's not really a file path, that is a module. Whereas that is a file path. And so you can switch back and forth, right? You can switch back and forth between many projects by changing those. There's two things you got to change here. You don't have to retype all this. You just change those two things. The word first, maybe it's local library, maybe it's my test app, who knows, but it's a way you change it. And then you go back to web tab, you change that file, the WSGI configuration file, and then you change the source code and you change the working directory, leave virtual environments alone, and then reload your application, and then you should see your application. Finish reloading, and here we are, drchuckpythonanywhere.com, hello world. So I've showed you how Python Anywhere and virtual environments work, which is sort of like the outer wrapping of your application. And now I'll just sort of show your application. Now, this all is described in the section under djfree_hello.md. Change the source code, change the, your virtual environment should already be pointing, right? And then you gotta, I tell you to change these things, your name is not first, right? So your DJ, everything, or I'm using first, you're using DJ free. And then I tell you to make some folders. So home is the first application. Underneath it, you're gonna put more in here. So you got to make the folder for templates, and folder for templates in templates home. The command to do that, so I'm in first, make dir home slash templates. This is going to fail because it's already there. Yay! And then you got to add it again, home templates home. Got to make that folder, so that you've got to do. I'll change that to put those instructions in. And then you got to create the file. Come back. Home slash templates slash home. So you got to put some HTML in. I'm going to put it in hello.html, and I say hello world. That's it. So I've got it. Okay, so I'm in hello world. Now you may have to put some more stuff in here, but that is the text that is this. Now let's talk about how it all gets to work. Now you've got to change the settings file, and in yours will be DJ free. Mine is first settings.py. I'm going to edit that. So there's a few things to look at here in this file. Oops. So some mistakes I've seen students do is this debug, you want it true. They're telling you to turn it to false if you're in production, but you're not really in production. You're writing your code. When you're developing, you want debug turned on, and that has to do with the fact that it gives you more detail when you make errors. Otherwise, it's very cryptic about your detail. So a lot of students will come in, I can't figure out what's wrong with my thing because it just says error. Well, that's because you have debug to false. Now, reading this comment, it's really quite reasonable, so I just remind you over and over, do not set it to false. Otherwise, you will have great difficulty dealing with your application. You have allowed hosts, which basically says who can hit this application, and you want basically anybody. That's anybody on the internet to hit it. Okay, so we have the apps here that we want. And so those are the things that you've got to do. Get debug right, get allowed host right, and get the apps right. Okay? So that's that file. Then you've got to edit the file first, or DJ free in your case, urls.py. And this, you'll put the admin and home URLs so that you can eventually do the admin. The admin is less important in this particular first application, but you're going to need it soon enough, so we might as well just put it in. And then include the URLs from the home application within the first project. Okay, and then if we take a look in the home folder, vi home/urls.py, so here I just am going to import a template view, and then I'm going to basically route slash, so it's basically routing. The global URL routes the no path into, come back, global URL routes no path. There's like nothing here, right? There's nothing blah blah blah, there's nothing after it, right, slash this. So it's like there's nothing on the URL. That gets routed into home.urls, and then I'm routing nothing within home.urls into just the template home/hello.html, and I'm giving it a name for no particular reason. Okay, and so those files, the first settings.py, the first urls.py, home urls.py, and the home templates home hello.html, those are the files that you've got to create. And then you go to your web tab and you make sure that your code section has pointing to the right folder, both source code and working directory. Your WSGI configuration has been edited to point to the right folder, and then load up the project-wide settings. And then I think I can hit back here, yeah. And then make sure your virtual environment is right. Don't keep changing this, okay? And at that point, you should be able to reload your application. Visit your URL, and it should talk. And if it fails, if you don't get that and it sends the little funky message, well, let's just do this. let's just cause the message. So I'm going to come in here in this WSGI configuration file, and I'm going to mess it up. Okay, and I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to go back to the web tab, and then I'm going to reload it. And if this goes well, something went wrong. Now everyone looks at this and they go like, oh, let's run and get help. It's telling you what to do. You look here in this error log first. I'm going to open it in a new window, drchuckpythonanywhere.com error log, and then scroll all the way to the bottom. Now the weird thing here is all of your errors that you've done, right, are in here. So you got to get all the way down, right? And you got to look at the bottom, and you can even look at the times of these things. And it's a traceback, so just like in any Python, there's a lot of stuff that has nothing to do with you. But look at this one. Module not found error. No module named XYZZY. Error running WSGI application, right? And, I just forced an error, right? And sometimes you can look in the server log to see it. If there's nothing that seems like it might be a suspect, you can check the server log. But the error log is mostly where you do this. So let me go fix that now. I made a mistake here, and I've got to change this to be first, XYZZY to first in the WSGI configuration, and then first again in the WSGI configuration, and then I save the file. Then I reload the application. This is up here in the file editing. I reload the application, and if all goes well, I should be able to reload it. So I hope this was helpful. It's a bit long. I wanted to just remind you of a whole bunch of things that can cause your application to go wrong. Part of the reason we're doing all this is so that your application can go right. But you've been working on the same application, and I want to get you focused on what it takes to build a new application and get that application running. Cheers. Welcome to another Django for Everybody code walkthrough. In this, I am going to walk through the Hello World application that you've got to do. This is the DIY part of the course where we've been developing an application for a while, and you've been modifying an existing application, local library, and its catalog, local library project catalog application. And it's time for you to start fresh, and I want you to really understand what's going on. So I'm going to go through in some great detail. So this tells you how to get started, and we're going to assume that you're running on your local computer. If you're still running Python Anywhere, that's okay. I've got another video for that. So somewhere you've got a folder called Django Projects, and so I've got my folder in, this is a Macintosh, and I've done all of the installation. I sort of followed this installation. Now the weird thing is there's so many different ways that you can install Python 3 and Django on your computer. You might use Anaconda or Miniconda or pip or whatever. And so I haven't given you like every single possible version of how you might do that. You have to kind of figure a bit of that out on your own. I've been giving you some online resources. But hopefully, when it's all said and done, whether you've done a virtual environment or not, you have things like Python 3 running, and you have Django, -m Django, Python 3 -m Django version, and you can look at what is your current pip. In mine, all my extensions. You might not even be using pip for your extensions, but if I say pip freeze, I use pip 3 to install them. Yeah, I see all the versions of all my extensions, and if I look through here, for example, I can find Django extensions, and that means that I have Django extensions. And some of the problems that people have are like when they don't have the right extensions installed. So here I am in Django projects, and if I do an ls, you see all the projects that I've got. I've got the local library and my test site. Those are from before. This is, DJ Free is the one you're going to work on, but you're going to work on that and add stuff to it, and so that's a later version of it. I made another one that's just this first Hello World, so I can take a look at it, and I named it first. And so you would do a Django admin start project DJ Free, but I did a Django admin start project first, and that's just the name of it. and then I went into that folder, and so I'm going into the first folder, first, and then I did a Python 3 manage py start app home, and so this shows that I've got a home folder, then this first folder, which is the project-wide settings.py and project-wide urls.py, and of course the db.sqli3. Now, at this point, when you're in this folder and you've got these things set up, it might not hurt to do a Python 3 manage.py shell, because if this doesn't work, then you've got some configuration wrong. So the fact that this worked and didn't blow up with a big traceback, that suggests that I've got all the right stuff installed, and it's good. So I just have to Control D to get out of here. So there we go. That's a funny looking shell prompt, but that's how it is on my Macintosh. So that's weird. Your Linux boxes and maybe your Windows boxes look a lot prettier than that. But the point is, if you can't run Python 3 manage py shell, make migrations isn't going to work, etc., because this manage.py loads up everything. It loads up all of your applications and all the urls.py and all the views.py. And so you think, oh, just start a shell. Well, no, this is completely construct the Django application and then start a shell in that Django application. So if there's anything wrong with any of your files, well, you go, now ignore this little part right here. The .quit didn't work. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the files that matter. So the first thing is that the folder that is the same name as the project folder, and my project folder is first. There is first/settings.py. And if you take a look, it tells you what to do here. A couple things I'll call your attention to. So leave debug true. Do not set debug to be false, even though the comment right above it will encourage you to do it. What it really is doing is telling it whether or not to give verbose error messages. When debug is true, the error messages are verbose. When debug is false, the error messages are cryptic. Well, you're writing software. You need all the help you can get when you make a mistake. You want verbose error messages. So debug equals true means verbose equals yes. Allowed host, this is one we've had to do every time we make one, where we basically, that is the addresses from the internet that are allowed to access this application. And then start project sets this up, and then you have to add a home config, your home apps home config. And so that is the setup to get your home application loaded. And if you take a look at first/urls.py, and by now, if you've done stuff in local library, your URLs are pretty complex. We've got pretty simple stuff. We're just going to include at the base URL all the home URLs, and then we're going to bring the admin in because we're going to need that later. So that is the urls.py. So that is the first things, and there needs to be a, in your home folder, urls.py, you have to create this file, but I give you the exact text of this file. And we're going to use a template view, and we're just going to have a template name. Remember that templates are global, and so we kind of re-add the, I just dragged that, I undid it. We add the home/hello.html in a way to kind of create a global namespace of templates. And so that's your urls.py, and I completely give that to you. And then the last thing that you're going to edit is the home/templates home. Again, you have to do this twice. Hello.html, and against this last part, home/hello.html matches the templates in the urls.py, and you just put HTML in here. And I just happen to put an H1 hello world. Now, if we are sitting here and we've got these things all correct, we just say Python 3 manage.py, run server. Now, this is going to connect to my local host 8000, 127.0.0.1/:8000. That's port 8000. And if you've got one of these running in a different window, it will say the port is already busy, but you're jacking into the port. If you go all the way back, we talked about the request response cycle and servers. You should remember about ports and how servers grab onto ports so they can listen for phone calls. So we are going to go into localhost 8000, actually just go on 27, doesn't matter. And so that retrieves our page. Now this shows a couple of cool things, because it showed the get. And so one of the nice things is you can watch things as they go on, and you see traceback errors and everything. And so I really like developing locally whenever I can, because I can really quickly switch from one application to another. So let me show you how I will switch from one application to the other. I'm going to hit Control-C to blow this up. So now there is no server. And if I go to this, it's going to say, sorry, I can't get that. And now I'm going to say cd ... I'm in my Django projects, and I've got a whole bunch of things. Let's go up one even more, and I've got DJ for each samples. So I've got this checked out, and there's a manage.py here, and I can say Python 3 manage py run server from this folder, which then runs that application. And now I can go to that exact same address, and I have a completely different application running on it. So this, and I can see the errors and favicons. This one actually has a favicon, I think. I don't know why the favicon didn't. Oh, maybe it doesn't do it for localhost. And so this ability to move around really quickly and start and stop servers in your Django application, and the ability to watch this stuff as it's running, is a real important part of why you'd run a local server if possible. And of course, I gave you installing Django locally that does its best, because each thing is going to be a little bit different, and away you go. Okay, so in general, this is how my Hello World application is structured. There's really only 4 files that you need to edit and get right, and then you have to mostly the hard part for local running is getting your installation all done. So I hope this helps. Cheers.
So now I want to talk about a concept called virtual hosting. Like I said, this doesn't really affect you directly, but I want to sort of show you a little bit about how an organization like Python Anywhere can have a very small amount of resources and support a very large number of hosts. And this is the idea that they have one piece of hardware or very few pieces of hardware and many different domains running on that system. And this also kind of helps you understand why you have to configure Python Anywhere the way you do to help them route the request not just to the server but to your application within the server where your application is running. So if you recall, with the request response cycle, HTTP, it makes a connection to a domain, and then it sends a GET request with the domain in the GET request. And so here we have the little sample. We say telnet data.pr4e.org, that's the host, and port 80, which is to say let's talk to the web server. And then we connect, and then we send the GET request. And the GET request has a couple of pieces, right? The GET request has, the name of the document, including the server that it's going to, and then the protocol, and then a blank line. The key thing is you don't just say, get me any document. You actually tell it the host that you're looking for. And by looking at this, that's how the virtual hosting works. And so it says, oh, I'm one host really, but I can pretend to be many hosts and know which host I'm being asked for with that information. And so that's how the virtual hosting works. So when a GET request comes into a server, it can say, I have many virtual hosts inside myself, and I'll pick the right one. And so if we look at the browser's debugger console, we can see that it's asking and doing a GET request to a particular Python Anywhere URL, and with a particular domain name, and the domain name is part of the request, which is what makes their virtual hosting happen. And so this is where in the web tab of Python Anywhere you've got to give this thing about where are you at, and you have to say within this server I'm running at this home folder, and so that's your home directory, Django projects local library, your working directory where it's supposed to go when it receives a request for you, and then it has this one configuration file, and you'll notice that that file doesn't belong, that www.mdntutorial_pythonanywhere.com_WGSI, the WGSI configuration file is not in your data space. So that's actually in the system, and that's the place where the system can look up where you're going, and then that file, and again if you read that file, you'll see it's telling where it's supposed to go in the overall system to start in a directory and load the configuration for a particular application, and up you go. And so this is kind of the picture of how it all works. You know, you got a browser out here, and that the browser is making many requests to this server, which is one piece of physical hardware, and then there's a little piece of software. Often it's a open source software called Nginx, and it has a whole bunch of configuration files that you put in their user interface, and it has little instances of Django, one for each of the domains in those systems. And so you're isolated from all the other ones, whether it's MDN tutorial pythonanywhere.com, DJ4E pythonanywhere.com, or just some other kind of thing. It doesn't even have to be Django, it can be just about anything. And so there are these configuration files that allow, and all this really accomplishes is reusing some of the server hardware so that you don't have to have a dedicated piece of hardware for every single piece of software. And then within that is what I showed you before, and that is how the request works in your settings file. But the goal of Nginx is getting it to your front door so that your application gets the requests that are destined for it. So this is both how these applications are combined into one server using virtual hosting, but also how applications work internally. And so I just wanted to give you a really short overview of how this all works so that you can build the picture a little bit at a time over the next few weeks as you learn this material. Hello and welcome to our lecture on owned rows in Django. So what do I mean by an owned row? Well, up to now, every CRUD application that you've written, you got a table or a model or two. Maybe they're connected, but basically if you log in, you can edit every row. And so if you do a list, you see an update and delete button on every row. Real applications don't work that way. If you're building a classified ad system, some ads belong to you and some ads belong to other people. You can see them all, but you can't edit them all. So we have to decide when to put the edit and delete buttons up and only do those for the owner. And we got to make it so you can't like sneak in and edit and delete other people's stuff. And so we have to protect these rows from being edited or deleted by anybody but the owner, but anybody can see them. And so that's why I call them owned rows. If there's a row that you own, you will see an edit or delete button. If there's a row you don't own, you'll see the row and the data and you'll be able to read it and view it, and that's it. And so if we go back to how we were working in our CRUD application, we were making heavy uses of these generic views, the generic list view. And so when we're all said and done, after a whole bunch of machinations, you ended up with a very, very simple view. You ended up with a horse list view that extended generic list view. Generic list view is provided to us by Django. And the only thing we had to do was take this code, which is several thousand lines of code, and inform it as to which model we want it to be, and then we make another view, right? So we make the horse list view by extending generic list view and informing that list view that we want to do this in the model with horses. And from that point on, all kinds of convention happens. And so we know things like the variable will be named horse list. It'll be a list of objects that are retrieved from the list of model objects that are retrieved from the database. And so we kind of know how that works. And it makes things really simple, not a lot of repetition. Every view kind of looks the same. You probably have done a cats, a dogs, a autos, a couple of different things. And they all look very much the same. And if you get good at it, you should be able to make these changes very rapidly. So if we look at how this is working kind of from an object-oriented perspective, we are making a new class called gview.views.horselistView, and we are extending, our parent class is the generic list view, and we're sort of adding our own little special sauce by saying one class variable model equals horse. Okay, and so that's kind of what's going on here. Now, in this owner view, we're going to do something quite similar, and that is when we're going to have an article, and this is all from the DJ4E samples my arts example, we're going to extend owner list view. Now, and soon we will look inside owner list view, and we'll see that owner list view is extending generic list view, and we're this model equals article is informing owner list view. The difference is this is our code. That belongs to us. And in the last part, we will show you everything that you have to do to build one of these things. And so we're taking the list view, which has almost everything we want, and we're going to add one feature to it, and then we're going to extend the list view and create a new view called owner list view, or you might call it list view for owned rows. And at that point, you're good. And this has this class owner list view, which we'll see in a second, has everything you need to deal with rows that are owned. And for example, we're going to have a owner column. So every article is going to have an owner, and if that's equal to the current logged in user, then we are going to show these little edit and delete buttons. But if the article owner, the owner value inside the article object, or the model, if that owner is not equal to the current user, we don't show it. Now, not showing a link does not mean you've protected it from editing. We'll show you later how that protection from editing happens. But this is such a common problem that we want to just be able to, in a sense, say, look, here's a list view. Here's a list view with this special owner column in it, and we want to maintain the owner column. We don't want to have to write hundreds of lines of code in every view that we want to have this owner column. So we just use object-oriented techniques to accomplish this. And so we're going to use inheritance, and we talked about it and talk about it again. Inheritance is the idea that you have a class, you're going to make another class that inherits all that parent class and then extends it, adds a little bit of stuff to it. And it's another form of don't repeat yourself. Do something once in a parent class. You make the parent class sometimes quite generic. Then you make a child class that extends the parent class, and then we use the child class. Or we could call them subclasses or child classes. There's a whole bunch of different terminology, and it's all pretty much equivalent. Subclasses are more specialized versions of a class. They inherit attributes and methods from their parent classes and can introduce their own. Again, basic object-oriented programming. So up next, we're going to talk a little bit about how it is that we can peek into one of these generic views and add our own special sauce for it. So now we're going to take a look inside of a generic edit view, and we want to look at how it functions internally so that we can override and extend some of those functions. So we can take the generic edit view and turn it into a edit view that supports an owned row. So this is a review. We've gone back a couple of lectures. This is the edit form flow, right? And I went through this in great and gory detail, so I'll just review it really quickly, right? So you've hit the edit button, right? So you do a get request to like /1 or /15. You're going to grab that data. Oops. You're going to go in. You're going to load the primary key 1 or 2 or 15. If you didn't find it, you're going to send in 404 error, and then you're going to fill the form with old data. The user's going to edit that data. They're going to post the good data. Then the form is going to be validated, of course, according to the form rules. Remember, the model kind of deals with the back end, and the form kind of deals with the front end. So the validation is a form aspect, and then if there's an error, it goes back and allows you to redo it. And then if there's no error in the submitted data, then we load a new model up. We reload the model, check to see if that model is accessible, and accessible is going to matter to a lot to us in a second. If it's there and you can read it, and you're legally allowed to read it, great. Otherwise, we're going to give you a 404 as you're submitting the data, and that has to do with if they messed with the form or something, or they're submitting it to the wrong URL. But if we can get the data, we change the data, and we store the updated data, and then we do the success URL, right? And so that's the basic form flow. We did that before. We did that with every one of our CRUDs. And we also looked at this documentation in the generic list view. It could be in some of the edit views. At some point you will see in the Django documentation, it's telling you how this class is functioning internally, how it's working its own magic inside itself. And this is method flowchart. First it's going to call setup, then it's called dispatch. Check to see if the method's allowed. get its template name, get a query set, load the data from the database, get the context object name, get the context data, and then render to response. And so you might say, why are they showing us all this? And the answer is because we can get our hands in and mess with these things. And these are like our access points into this generic list view class that allow us to dig in and make changes. And so if we were to look at that same picture and think of it from the point of view of which methods are being called at the moment where this generic edit, in this case it's going to be an edit view, this generic edit view is happening. So here we go. So the GET request comes in, it's got some primary key, so it does a GET query set, and it reads this thing, and then it reads it using GET query set. It's still reading it, but it happens to be doing it in a method called GET query set. And if GET query set works or doesn't, then it keeps on going. Then as it's rendering the template, it's going to get the context data by calling a method called getContextData. That's another place that we're going to play with, and we're going to inject ourselves into getContextData. Then we'll do the edit, the post will come in, and then it's going to do validation, but it does it in a method called formValid. So the first thing that happens upon the receipt of post is it checks to see if the form is valid. We're going to add our own little code into formValid as well. If it goes back, it does a render, so it's going to use getContextData. If it is good, there's no error, then it's going to actually call getQuerySet again to get the data, and then it's going to modify the data, and then it's going to store the data. There's some name for this, but I didn't put it in. The point is, each of these moments where there's something critical going on, formValid getQuerySet, that's a place where we can extend the behavior of this built-in class without knowing too much about the class. And I showed you at the end of a few lectures ago this crazy override. I did this crazy override where I made this weird equine view, and I have a model of car and a template name, and then I'm overriding getQuerySet. So this is extending generic list view, but instead of using the getQuerySet that's in generic list view, we're going to call our own getQuerySet. So instead of reading car objects, we're going to read horse objects. And then we're going to return a list of them. And that's what the getQuerySet has to do. The rule of getQuerySet is you get called, you have to return a list. If we didn't write this code, it would do this except with car. But we did write this code. Why? Because we wanted to override it. Was there any logic to it? No, just because I wanted to show you crazy things, right? And so because I've overridden in the generic list view, it's not calling the generic list view's query set at all, which would look at the model car, but instead it's calling mine that's in wacky equine view. And so when it prints out, you see a list of horses, not a list of cars, because I overrode what behavior was inside the list view class, which normally would be informed by that, but my code in here ignored it. Again, I have no purpose for this other than showing you that I can change the behavior of the parent class while creating a derived class. Now sometimes, in this case, I'm just completely overriding it, and it's like, I don't care what you were going to do before, I'm going to do something completely different. And you have to know what the rules are. I had to know what the return. It took me a while to write this, and I might have even looked at some Django source code to figure this out. But eventually, through Stack Overflow, I figured this out. So this is not trivial to write, and I'm not expecting you to write this. I just want to show you the technique. Like this keyword args, that's something. I'm sure at some point I knew what it was, but I just stole that off of Stack Overflow like everybody does. So, in this def get query set, you'll see that I have just overridden and ignored the def query set from generic list view. Okay? That's one way of overriding a method. Another way of overriding a method is this get context data. So what is get context data going to do? Well, at some level, get context data is what puts in this list ends up going into horse list, right? So that's somehow this variable that I return here in query set ends up being put into my context as horse list, so then I can write this loop that prints that stuff out. And that's by convention, right? It actually looks at the type of this thing and says, oh, that's a list of horses. So it makes up the variable and puts it in the context. Now, where that's being done in generic list view is in a method called getContextData. And so I actually don't want to completely replace getContextData, although I probably could if I want, because this is so simple. What I actually want to do is I want to augment the context, and I want to throw something else in it. So what I want to do is I want to run the code from generic list view first. I want to get the context back from that, and then I want to add something to it, and then return sort of like this composite context. Okay? And it's not, the syntax is a little scary, but it's okay. So let's take a look at getContextData. Just like anything, self is the instance. Self is always the instance. KWArgs is just a way of taking all the parameters so I can pass them in. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to say, hey, super. Super is like calling getContextData in generic list view. So go into my superclass. Wacky Equines view is a subclass. List view is my superclass. Super, getContextData, and pass whatever arguments were going in there. We're all good. So just call that. Do it. And pass in all the arguments. And do whatever. And that's what ends up putting in horse list. And so at that point, context is going to be a dictionary that has horse list in it. But then I want to put some more stuff in. So then that goes into generic list view and then comes back out of generic list view and gives me, and if all I did is return to context, then I really wouldn't have changed anything. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw in this little extra key called crazy thing and put the string crazy thing in it. And then I return all that, and then eventually it goes into the template, and this context finds its way into the template. And again, that's all inside of generic list view, and eventually horse list is there because of the call to the super, and crazy thing is there just because I explicitly put it in. And so I have augmented without replacing. The first one I completely replaced getQuerySet. In the second one, I called the parent, and then I augmented the return value and then returned kind of the combination of what the list view did and what I want to add to the list view. So we're going to use both of these techniques coming up when we start talking about the owner list, the owner.py code, and how we can then jack in to this generic code and implement our owner field. So that's the next thing that we're going to do. So hello. With all that as lead up, we are going to finally start taking a look at how we actually build this owner list view. So let's take a look. So the basic idea is we're going to make a new class called owner list view, owner update view, owner create view, a whole series of classes that sort of mirror the generic ones, and we're going to add our own little sauce. And we are going to basically make our owner list view, which is going to extend generic list view, and we're going to extend owner list view to create article list view. So the thing we ultimately end up with as our view is sort of 3 layers deep, where we have our view that extends another one of our views that extends a view that came from Django. And so there we go. And so things like article list, the HTML as the template, and all that convention, and the name of the variable article list, that's all convention. And we've been doing that quite a bit. So let's start with the models changes. Now in this model, everything except one line should be familiar to you and pretty comfortable. The only line that's a little bit different is this owner line. So it's just another field. It turns out to be an integer. It's a foreign key, like all foreign keys are integers. And on delete models cascade, you have seen that before. That simply means if we have a bunch of articles that are linked to a user and we delete that user, it deletes the 4 articles that were associated with the user in order to keep the internal pointers consistent. So that part is all the same, quite comfortable, and you've been doing that for a while. Now, settings, auth, user, model. We're importing settings from Django, and we are making a foreign key to a model that is not ours. It is something that Django maintains. Django always has a user model somewhere. It may be named one thing or a different thing. We just don't know. We don't know what the name of the user model is, and so we have to ask Django for it, and Django conveniently always leaves it in this location, settings.auth user model. And it turns out if you want to change it, you got to change that variable. But for us, we're not going to change where it's at. Django's going to set it for us, and we're just going to use it. So there's two tables. There's this article table and some user table somewhere, and there's a foreign key relationship between them in a database level. And once you make this database, you could go see what the name of that table is, because it will show you the create statement that it actually used. Not that that matters. And so it's pretty much a normal old thing like we've been making, except it's got this extra owner column. And that's what that's the thing we're focusing on right now. Okay, so the views are going to be pretty straightforward. The thing you're going to see about the views is we're not going to use the generic list view, the generic detail, the generic blah, blah, blah. We're going to make our own. These are made by us, myarts.owner. So we'll see owner.py in a second. And so article list view, which is we got a urls.py that routes here, is going to extend owner list view and say, do this model. Things like the template name and everything, that's all done by convention, right? So we're going to have a detail view, a create view. Now the one thing that's different about the create and update is there are two things. There's a form, which tells what shows up on the screen, and then there is the model back here that shows up what ends up in the database, right? So the model, article model, is what's in the database. The form is what we show on the screen. So the model is which model is in the database, and fields are which model fields are to be put on the screen. We're not going to show all of the fields on the screen. In particular, we are not putting the owner field in, because we're not letting the user say this is owned by number 12. If it's owner 12, great. That number 12 is the current logged in user. It's not something we let the user see. So we don't put owner in here. We put the title and the text. We don't put updated at or created at, all the things from the model. We have to tell that we want this to put in the form and that to put in the form. This is going to be handled internally, and all these three are going to be handled internally. Owner, created at, and updated at are handled internally. Text and title are to be shown to the user. And so here we are in article create view, and we're saying this is the model, and make a form based on that model, but only for two of the fields. Ignore the other fields. The same for an update, and then the delete, it doesn't use an actual form, so you just tell it which model it's going to use. So again, this is a triumph of don't repeat yourself. All the brains of this operation are really add an owner column, add an owner column, and then extend these classes that we are about to make. Extend the classes that we're about to make. Now I want to show you how to make the classes. So I show you the easy stuff. Now we talk about the hard stuff. Okay. So this is the owner update view. And so let's take a quick review of the owner update view. And when we first do a GET request, if we go look at the documentation, it says, oh, I want to show you the old data in a form, and I'm going to call a function called getQuerySet in generic update view. Okay? And if I can't get anything, if I don't get anything, I'll give you an error. So this is like to a URL like /edit/2. And if the 2 is not in the database, then you're going to get a 404. So we call getQuerySet. Okay? And so let's just take a look at getQuerySet. So the way we're going to do this is, because we're in the middle of an update, the user is intending to modify it, which means we're not going to let them modify it unless they're the actual owner. So what we're going to do is we are going to override the query set. And I just put a print statement in for yucks. And so the first thing we're going to do is get the default query set. This is going to pick the model that we're going to query, and it's probably going to say something like, the primary key is whatever that number was, 2 or 14. And so we're going to actually get a query set back. And so that says, super, go into owner update view, no, not owner update view, go into update view and go run its query set, and then give me back that query set. And then what I'm going to do after I got that query set is add a AND clause to filter it that says, okay, whatever that primary key was, fine. And the owner column of this model must match the current logged in user. And so it's like I'm adding a where clause and an and to the where clause. The other thing that you'll notice here is login required mixin. I could have put login required mixin on all those in the views.py, but I need to have this variable self request user properly defined, which means any owner update view, you really can't use it unless you're logged in. So it's like I'm going to put the login required mixin here. That's like a marker interface that says, look, if you're not logged in, send them to log in and then come back here. And if they can't log in, I'm never going to let them run this code. Because if you let a non-logged in user run this code, it would blow up right there. So in a sense, this is like a guardian pattern to say, don't even bother coming in here if you're not properly logged in and you don't have a user object properly passed in as request.user. And so that's why I put login required mixin there. So the key here is we're going to do a where clause that is where ID equals 7 and owner equals 14, whatever the current logged in user is. And so that means that when you come in here, if you're trying to edit a thing, you're going to get a 404, right? If it doesn't exist, you're going to get a 404, or if you don't own it, you're going to get a 404. 404 is not found. And it's legit to say it might be there, but you didn't find it because you were trying to read it for updating. So by changing the query set, in a sense, to return 0 records when you don't own the record, because this is an update view. If you look at the list view, it doesn't do any tricky stuff because you can list them all, right? And so a list view is no big deal, a detail view is no big deal, but an update or a delete view, yeah, detail view and list view are good, but an update and a delete, you have an intention of modifying it, so we're not even going to let you retrieve the record if you don't own it. So we do that by overriding the query set, calling the super, and then augmenting the query set when we get it back so that it accomplishes what we want to achieve. So the next thing we're going to look at is how we actually store the data. And the storing of the data is in form valid. We're going to override form valid. And what form, remember when the post data comes in, we're going to, it first calls form valid. That checks to see if the things are the right length, if it's a date, it's the right format. Who knows what it does, but we're also going to override it and stick our own code in form valid. So yes, it's going to do all those checks, but also we're going to do a little sneaky thing to make what we want to do that's going to solve the create and update situation, but it's mostly for the create. And so in the create view, it sends out a blank form, and then in comes the data, but we never showed owner. Let's go back a little bit, right? So if we're going create view, the form that we're going to send out is title and text. There is no owner field. Now this owner is required, and so we have to get the owner in. So what we do here, it's really quite simple. We're going to, so there's a form object, which is kind of like the UI side of things, and then there's a model object. And so form.save commit equals false says just copy the data into an object as if we were going to store it, but don't actually store it. Commit equals false is make it, but don't store it. And then we're going to add the owner field, which is there, to be self-request user. Now self-request user, remember, is like 16. It's some number. It's the primary key of the user. And so that's going to copy 16 in here. And then we're going to save it. But then we're also going to do the validation and call the super to do form validation for us. And so we're calling the create view form validation as well to make sure everything else is done properly. Okay? Okay, so when it's all said and done, all we have to do to make an owner work in this situation is we add an owner column, foreign key to the right place, we import owner delete view, and then we just extend owner delete view to make article delete view, and then tell it which model to work in, and then the magic all happens. So I'm not going to show you owner delete view, just you know that it's going to force login, and it's going to only let you delete rows that you own in the system. And so this is really a neat example of how you can use the object-oriented pattern to extend these existing things and give features that you want to add to them. I'm going to guess the first 10 of these are going to be just add an owner field, because it's such a common thing to have a database rows that have an owner field in them. But we can do other things beyond just an owner field. And it again is a nice review of object orientation. I'm just going to hit object orientation over and over and over and over again because it's hard to get it, and I want to tell it to you as many times as I can. And again, we don't like putting don't repeat yourself, lots of boilerplate to do this owner. You could do it all in a view, you really could, but you really don't want to. You want to basically make an object yourself. We've been using other people's objects. Now we're extending object classes to make our own classes and then using those classes. So it's a good example of how we can save a lot of time and energy with object orientation and inheritance.
Hello and welcome to another walkthrough for Django for Everybody. In this walkthrough we are going to play with crispy forms. Crispy forms are a good example of how Django just has something and you plug it in and things just get better and it doesn't take much work on your part. So the simple thing is let's take a look at a boring form. This is the kind of form we've been doing in our CRUD. And I'm using a form to do it, and all I have to say is let's just make that a crispy form. And now things are pretty. They got all these colors. They got the highlight. There's a bunch of CSS. Forms are actually, the markup of forms is actually surprisingly complex. If we take a look at the markup in this crispy form, it's got some CSS in there, and it's just, there's a lot to it. So if we look, we got all these classes and fancy stuff, and so crispy takes care of that for us. And the key, I'll show you in a second, the key difference is just not that big of a deal. So let me walk through the code. So here is my crispy URLs. So what we're going to do is use the same view and just switch between two templates, one called boring and one called awesome. Crispy is Urban Dictionary for awesome or cool or whatever. I'm not sure how cool of a word cool it is, but doesn't matter. This is a riff on some of the forms code. This is a real basic form. I don't have any models in this one, and so I'm just using forms and putting them on the screen. And so I just got a simple form with a string, mileage, and purchase date. And that validator so I can make some mistake. And this is just a view, just similar to other things we've done in forms. I'm making a class that extends view, and I've got to set this template name to none, because really what I want to do is I want to pick the template name here in urls.py. Something about how Django works, you've got to put this in so that then you can override it here. And I like putting templates in here and success URLs in here when I possibly can. It just seems like the routing is going on here in urls.py, and so I like doing that. So you'll note there's only one view, but we're doing two things, and that's because we're just taking self template name and doing the exact same thing. And so the boring form, it basically is loading some old data, making a form, pulling in the initial data for that, and then passing it into the template and then rendering the template. The post, if I submit the post, this would be saving the data. You read the post data, check to see if the form is valid. If it's not, send an error message, and then if we'll see a flash message. I'll show you that in a bit, and then we just redirect to a reverse. So let's just see, for example, what happens if we violate a rule. We get this, please enter 2 or more characters. And that's something we've been doing before, and that's just kind of the get post of an edit form. So let's take a look at the template that creates this, right? We're going to do base bootstrap, put a title in, override a welcome. So if you take a look at base bootstrap, I should add a link here to show you base bootstrap. cd.vi home templates, base bootstrap. So base bootstrap has a number of different blocks that we can override. The title block, the head block, which is some material to put before the slash head, a navigation bar if we want it, a welcome message, and then we'll talk about these little flash messages in a second, like alert messages, and then the content, and then some footer. Maybe we want to put some JavaScript in at the bottom of a page. And so we've got these hot spots in Bootstrap, base Bootstrap HTML. So we're going to extend it. We're going to set the title. I'm going to put an H1, which is like a welcome. It's the beginning of the body, and then there's going to be some messages that come in here in a second. And then here's our normal block. So we got a form. We have to put the CSRF token in. That just puts out that input hidden tag so that we avoid cross-site request forgery, CSRF. And we're going to use form as table. Form is the context variable. As table basically renders it as a series of table rows. And then slash table. And so if we do an inspect element here, let's do page source because my screen's too small so that you can see it on a sweet little mobile. So it's got the table, and then it's using TRs and THs and slash THs and just kind of putting it out. Not a lot of CSS. It's using the table so that these things can be lined up. That's what it tried to do. It has some aesthetic, and away it goes. Okay, and so the form as table, like if you make a mistake, this ends up view page source. Close that one. You see that this is just another somewhere here. Where's the error message? Yeah, it's just another table row, and it uses the table, and the table helps it do all this alignment, but it's not very pretty. Okay, and so then we have the table, we have our submit buttons and our cancel buttons, and we end our form. And so we've been doing this now for a while, just making boring forms. So let's start by, so if I go to awesome, so I go to cancel here and I go to the awesome form, then I am going to render, right, crispy awesome HTML instead. And so let's go there. So it looks almost the same. So here's boring, and here is awesome. So most of it is identical. It's extending base bootstrap. It's setting up a title. It's putting up a welcome chunk. But then we have this. So this is, you know, when you're using a curly brace % load crispy form tags, that's like running code basically, like the URL, this curly brace URL crispy main.py. That's running code. It's like the reverse. It's calling reverse to compute a URL given a string as a parameter. So this is sort of like making sure crispy is loaded for this page. If you do not do that, then this curly brace form vertical bar crispy will not work. Then the rest of this form is identical, except we just don't tell the form to render itself as a table. We use vertical bar crispy here, form vertical bar crispy, and this is called a filter. And we'll see another filter in an upcoming video where we'll make actually one of these filters ourselves. So we're taking the form object and piping it through a bit of code from the crispy library. And so that renders, it's not in a table, that renders all of the HTML for title, purchase date, and all that stuff. And it has all the CSS and makes it all gorgeous, right? So that's what it does. So form crispy does all that, and that's the main difference. Other than loading crispy form tags, that's the key thing. Everything else is the same. We had a table, form as table and slash table, and then we load crispy form tags, and then we just pipe form vertical bar crispy, and everything else is the same. And then we get this beautiful crispy form. And it makes things consistent. So you just use crispy forms. I'm not saying you can't build your own form system, but for me as a software developer, I like starting out with something that looks half pretty, and then away it goes. So that's crispy forms. That's how you use crispy forms. But let me show you a little bit more about how that works. Let me close a couple of my windows. So one of the things that happens is you've got to load in your settings.py, you've got to add crispy forms to your installed app. So that's when you're, so if you do like Python 3 manage py check, you've been doing this a lot, it loads up all these things. And so it's checking and loading and loading, and it's reading through this settings.py, it's loading all of these things. Like this humanize is a thing that we'll talk about that later. Django extensions, we'll talk about that later. All these things we'll talk about later, but crispy forms is a code library that you're at that point pulling in. So if you don't put that in, then crispy forms is going to blow up. It's going to blow up right here because it can't load the crispy form tags. Okay, so that's the first thing. But then you have to install this, and you probably don't recall, in the very beginning, I had you check out, let me go to that, www.dj, I got it right here, djfree.com, lessons, installing Django and Python anywhere. So if I look at the assignment specification you did a very long time ago, you make a virtual environment, you go into your virtual environment, and then I told you to go grab DJ free samples. This is in the very beginning of the class, and I told you to pip install -r requirements.txt. And requirements.txt is a file that looks like this. And what it does is pip reads this file and downloads a bunch of extensions. Django Crispy Forms, Django Filter, Django REST Framework. And so literally now for weeks, you have had these all, it's installing it into your virtual environment. And that's why sometimes if you run Python check and you're not in your virtual environment, it'll blow up. But then I say, oh, well, go into your virtual environment and it starts working, right? I need to run server because I'm running this locally. Okay, so because you installed these things you installed the requirements into your Django 3 virtual environment. And so that's why when it reads the settings.py and sees crispy forms in the installed apps, then it's like, oh, crap, I don't have it, but that's because you're running the loading of this file not in your virtual environment that has all that stuff installed. And if you're doing this outside the class, you will want to make a virtual environment and then do the pip install for requirements.txt. So that's two prerequisites. Edit settings.py, make sure you have crispy forms in your requirements, and then pip install from the requirements. And then it's pretty simple. You just load the crispy form tags and then pipe the form object in a template through the crispy filter, and then you will get gorgeous forms without hardly even trying, and you just keep using it. So that's our summary of crispy forms. I hope you find it useful. We'll pretty much use crispy forms from this point forward in the course. Cheers. Hello and welcome to a walkthrough for Django for Everybody. So the walkthrough that we're going to be doing is the walkthrough for the My Articles, which is really focusing on the notion of owning rows in a model. And what I've got going here is I'm logged in twice. I'm logged in one with a user ID of 1 and the other is a user ID of 2. So let's just do a quick demonstration of what really owning rows in a model is. So here I'm logged in as my first user, and now I'm logged in. I'm using a separate browser because this is Safari and this is Firefox. You can't just do this with tabs because the cookies are shared between tabs, and so you can log in and log out. I want to just be logged in simultaneously. Okay, and so I've got two of these tabs. Refresh. So you'll notice that the edit and delete buttons show up differently for different users, and that's because this row in the table lawnmower belongs to this user, user number 2, and these two rows belong to this user. So if I take a look at administration and I go down into groups, not groups, users.
Now I can kind of hover, figure out that CSEV is 2. You can kind of see at the bottom there. And DJ Free is user 1 and CSEV is user number 2. So those are the primary keys in Django's user table. And now if I go and I take a look at these articles, you will see, and this looks a lot like if you were looking at, say, your autos. Here's the rows or the models in articles. And if I look at lawnmower, you see that there is a title, some text, and the owner is a drop-down. And that's because this is a one-to-many field. This is a one-to-many field between the articles and the users. And then if I switch to a different, so that's CSEV. So CSEV owns the lawn. Yeah, CSEV owns the lawnmower. I'm logged in as DJ Free here. Oh, no, here. That's my name. I'm DJ Free. And if I switch to the trombone, we'll see that that one belongs to DJ Free. Now I can sit and edit this in admin, right? But that's not the point. The point is to build software. If you'll notice, when I create a new article, it doesn't ask me what user it was, right? So this is where you would say Dodge or whatever when you were doing cars. So this is like a race car, slightly used, neon. So now I have another one, right? And so the key thing is it looks like a create from things we've done before. And if I look at my articles, here's this, but somehow magically this owner field is populated. And that's the essence of owned rows, is we've got a row, a column, and these are marked, and we know in all our code, we know the difference, for example, between things we own and things we don't know, things we own and we don't own. So if I hit refresh over here, there's a slightly used race car, but it slightly used race car, but I can't edit it, right? So that's the ownership. Now, I don't know where to start. There's a lot to cover here. Let me show you. I don't know. Okay, I'll just start with where we always start. Let's start with, I'm running this locally. I don't know what that bug is there. That's not a bug. So this just looks kind of like your autos. If you look at it, it looks pretty much like the autos. I might add a mileage or price in there or something. The only thing that's really different at all is this. There's a foreign key. Now in your autos, you had a foreign key to makes. And the key difference here, the only thing that's new is this idea of where the foreign key is pointing at. Now the problem is in Django, there is actually a table that all these users live in. And I can probably come over here and type .tables. And I can see it. I think it's probably here. So let's just try saying select star from auth user. So we should see a bunch of rows. And so there are my users. CSEV, it's all jammed together in DJ Free. So this is row 1 for DJ Free and CSEV. So there is a table and a model. The difference is we're not allowed to know that this is the user model in the auth application. And so what happens is we have to let Django tell us what the name of that model is. And so we go into settings, which is settings.py actually. And we're going to pull in the settings.py, and the default is auth user model, and that's the name of the model. And so this is a foreign key to a place that we don't exactly know, but Django will tell us and put in a string here. If we were to print this out, we would see what that is. That's just a string, but it's not a string we mess with. On delete cascade, that's just normal. The kind of parent row, the one row is in users, and if you delete a user, that means that all of the rows that belong to that user will get deleted because on delete cascade. I'm choosing that as the model. And so you see created at, if we go into that back into you see all of these things. Now created at admin doesn't show. It's pretty smart knowing about created at and update, so it doesn't bother doing that. And it actually updates them automatically, so it knows something about created at and updated at in admin. Okay. So that is our model. If we were to take a look at my arts article, we will see that there is a foreign key right there. There's a foreign key. And if we say select star from my arts article, we will see that there is a foreign key in there. So this row belongs to user 1, this row belongs to user 1, that row belongs to user 2, and that row belongs to user 1, which is perfectly reflected here. So now I am user 1, so I can edit 3 of them. And now I am here with user 2, and I can edit 1 of them. So I'm editing the ones where I own it. So ultimately, we're going to write a bunch of code so that these numbers are properly updated. So when you add the article, it works the way you want it to work. Okay, so let's just take a look at urls.py. It's pretty boring. This looks just like autos. I probably hoisted up success URL here, put that in the as view as a parameter, and so that makes my views even simpler. My arts : all points to that view. I think it actually is kind of prettier to put it in here because this is sort of a URL place, and so it's not in my views. So that makes my views really succinct. And so it's like what you did once you got your autos down to like just using the generics. And so I have a list, a detail, a create, an update, and a delete. And I have a model called article, which I just showed you. And I am going to reuse some general purpose views for owner kinds of rows. Now, these are not from Django. These are from me. I made them. And now I'm using them. So article list view extends owner list view. And then I can put all my things in there. The success URL, actually, I don't need that here, but for create view, I do need a success URL, but for create view, that success URL comes right from here. So I could have put it either here or I could have put it here. For me, it just kind of, after a while, I think this is prettier because now I can look all, the names of my arts, etc. So that's kind of nice. Okay, so here's views. We're going to come back to this. All the brains of this operation are in owner list view, owner detail view, create view, update view, and we'll look at that last. So that's where the hardest part is. But let's first look at the template. And so here's the template. This looks a lot like your autos. The only real difference here is that this edit and delete button is inside of an if statement. So it's, article update, article ID, article delete, article ID. That's the same. You've done that, right? But if all it says is if article.owner is equal to the current logged in user, article.owner is one of the article lists, and that's just one of the fields in the model, which happens to be a number, but we're given this user for free, right? It just hands us user, and so we can compare it. So if this is one that we own, we show this link, and if it's not one we own, we don't show the link, right? So we don't show the link for the ones that we own. Now, I hope by now you realize that we have to also protect, right? So if this is number 4, right, and if I click edit number 5, but what if I just change this to 4? We still, just not putting up the link does not mean that we can't have someone go to that link. So I'm cheating by putting in this link, but this is going to blow up, right? And so we'll show you how just because you don't put the link up doesn't mean that people can't go to the link. They can guess what the link is. I just did that. I went to an article I could update. I noticed the primary key of one I could not update to be 4, and then I went to 5, and then I just edited, changed it to 4, and I attempted to update 4. So it's not good enough just to not show the link. That's actually not security. That just is prettiness, usability. Don't show a link that is going to blow up if you click on it. So that's not really protecting us. This if statement is not really protecting us from clicking on or attempting to go edit or delete. It's just not showing it if it's not going to work. Okay. And again, article.owner is just a column in this model, and user is the current logged in user. Okay? Okay, So what we'd seen before is I would create a view and then use it in my urls.py, and I would extend another view. So now it's time to take a look at where this view is being defined. And so here's our view, generic view, the generic list view, delete view. These are the generic ones, and all I'm really doing here is I'm creating a class called owner list view that extends list view. Now, it pulls in everything that list view is, and you'll notice I've added nothing to it. And I really could, because the list view doesn't really care. It's not really doing anything other than the fact that that value is in the models, so it's going to come in, right? So I could have made this be list view, but I just want it to be pretty. I want to make it so that I could just say owner list view, owner detail view. And so you'll notice that I'm not making any changes at the moment of inheritance. I'm not changing owner. So owner list view is exactly the same as list view, and owner detail is exactly the same as detail. I just did it to make it pretty in case later maybe I want to add some. But now we get to owner create view. Owner create view is something that matters a lot. So there's two things we've got to do for owner create view. So let's go ahead and start to add an article. So the first thing is there is no field here for which user it is. It would be kind of silly, and I can actually mess this up. So if I go to create view here and I add user, then if I hit refresh on the create view, oh, come on, wait, back up. Oh, it's not user. Owner. So if I add it to that list, and part of this, what's going on here, is there is both a model and a form. This fields equals is informing the form, and the form is the user interface. So look at this. I'm allowing the user to specify it, and now they can set the owner. Pretty convenient. Well, that's not what we want. So that's why in this create view, you say, don't let them set the owner. I don't want them to see the owner, because it takes a little while for this thing to restart. Okay, now it's restarted, and I can hit refresh. So when it was blowing up, it was just because I was coming here too fast. What is that? I don't know what that is. So go back to the views. Maybe I have some tiny little bug. I'll dig through that bug later. It's working. It's probably passing the autograder, so I'm pretty happy. So remember that there are two sides to this. One is the database side, and that's what the model deals with. And then there is a form. So these views, this list view, if you recall, once we tell it the model, it actually makes a form. So in this create view, it's making a form from article, copying all the fields in article or the fields according to this little list. And so that's why we're doing it. So the key there is we're explicitly not putting owner in there, and we're not putting created at or updated at. If I wanted to put created at in here, I'd say, hey, let's show them created at. Okay, let's refresh. Okay. Oh, okay. So again, it's trying to take a model, it's trying to go from the article model to make a form, and it's not an editable field, so it's mad at me. So I'll go back and fix it. I'm sorry. Okay, you get the idea. It uses this list of fields to make a form. The same for article and for update. In fact, the update and the create are so equivalent that the template for them is shared. It's basically, we'll talk about crispy tags separately in a different little video. The form is the same. The difference is when the update comes, there is already data in it. That's the only difference between a create and an update. It looks exactly the same, but update has data in it. A create has no data in it. So the code between create and update is super equivalent. Very, very similar, and the template is similar as well. Okay, so there we go. So we got create view, delete view, etc. Now, I'm going to focus on create view. And the key to create view is now in owner.py. Here's our form. That's pretty straightforward. In owner.py, this create view now has a little bit more to it. The list view and the detail view just inherited. So the first thing is that create view has a login required mixin. And that's because if you're going to create it, you need to be a logged in user. But to view it, you don't actually have to be a logged in user. Or if I was to, okay, let me log out here. So now I'm logged in as anybody. And so I can see all these. I can't edit any of them. I could log in if I want. And a detail view also works. So I'm completely logged out here. But add article. Yeah, so add article is protected by login. So owner create view, login required mixin. And I do this because I don't want to trust the user who's writing this view to put the login required mixin here, because I am writing code right here that depends on the fact that this person is logged in. So this is like a guardian pattern. If I'm putting this in here so I don't end up with tracebacks inside my code. I don't want, if I didn't put this in if I didn't put login required mixin in owner create view, then they forgot to put owner in the views.py, they forgot to put it in an article create view, then this code would blow up. It would trace back at when I tried to set object owner to self request user. It would just blow up. Okay, so so I'm extending create view, which is inheriting all the functionality, and I'm only going to override one method. This is object orientation. And you got to go read all the documentation. This documentation right here. Show you that documentation. Doop, doop, doop. So, this documentation is hard to find. And I'm sure I helped myself by doing some Stack Overflows. So that's why I put little notes at the bottom of the file, the things that took me a long time to find. So this form model mixin, and that is what they're really doing is they're giving us for these editing fields, like the update, they're saying these are the functions that are in this, and I can override them. So the one that I'm overriding is the form valid. And what that does is it basically says, here's your form, save it to the database, and set the current object for view, and then redirect to get success URL. Okay, that's its job, except that right before it's going to save the form instance, I want to do something myself. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm saying, and the form is what's being called as the parameter, which is the form that has been pulled in from the post data and handed to me. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say save it, but don't save it to the disk. That's what commit equals false means. Don't save it to the database. Just save it into this variable object. And then I'm going to set the object owner. I'm simply going to copy the current logged in user into owner. And then I'm going to set it to the database. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to call the original form valid, passing form in as a parameter that's in this class. And that's really not going to do much, right? Because it knows that it's already been saved, so it's not going to save it again. And then what it's going to do is it's just going to do the redirect to the success URL. So this is rather late in the process of create view. It's been validated, it's checked for bad data, etc., etc., etc. And so this is like right before the redirect happens, okay? And so at a high level, my whole goal was to pause the saving of this data to the database and sneak the current logged in user into the owner column and then be done with it. And so that's the basic overriding. I'm really extending form valid to cause my code to be called right before the default code is called. Okay? Okay, so that's owner create view, and that's how once I add an article and put some stuff in and I submit, right as I submit it, right before it's saved, there is a little field called owner that's going to be updated, boop, and it's there. And so the owner field came from this code. Now I don't have to, I could have put this in this view.py, but no, I got this really awesome creatable thing. I can write really cool code. I'm going to make hundreds of views that are, and we will through the rest of the semester do this over and over and over again. We're never going to change this file again. Okay? So now let's talk about edit. Okay, so there's two things. So here we're going to load Article 6, and then we're going to put out a form that has all this stuff. So the first thing that's got to happen in owner update view is we got to check to see if this belongs to the current logged in user. Remember when I tried to go to whatever it was, 4 here, and it blew up? This is the moment where I'm going to protect it. So if we take a look at the moment where it's loading the model, do I have a link to that? Django populate. Let's go to Stack Overflow here. This one I got from Stack Overflow. Been there 10 years, probably a good one. Right. I don't like that one. Using middleware. Somewhere in here. I should make that link be a better link. Yeah. Oh, I like this one. I'm going to put a link in just to this one here. Link straight to that one. It's telling us what to do. You see, I just borrowed this right there. Form valid. Over. Oh wait, no, that was the create. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Can't find quickly where I can do this, but query set. So query set is called when it's loading ID number 4. Okay, so it's going to do a load. So query set is not the actual load, but it is the query to the database that we're going to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tweak the query set, and this query set is probably going to say, show me where ID equals 4, right? So I'm going to say, it's going to say something like select from articles where ID equals 4. And if I just did the normal query set, it would work. But I'm going to change the query set. I'm going to change the query set. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call the default getQuerySet in the superclass, which is the delete view class. And that's going to say query where the primary key equals 4 in this particular case. But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another filter. This is like and owner equals the current logged in user. So so number 4 is owned by user 2, but a logged in user is 1. So this is going to be and logged in as user 1. So when it does the query, it says, give me the thing that's ID equals 4 and user ID equals 1. It's going to get no records. And so as the delete code, or the update, am I looking at delete? Update and delete are the same here. Oop. Before it does an update, it has to load the old data. And I have made it so that if you're not loading data on something that you own, then it's going to give you a 404. So it's like that wasn't found. Now 4 does exist, it just doesn't exist for the current logged in user. But 5 does, and it does belong to me, right? Now the other thing is when it's going to call getQuerySet again, new stuff, XYZ 1 2 3. So when you submit it, it actually is going to call getQuerySet one more time before it actually stores the data. And so let me show you. This will be kind of tricky. So I'm going to try to mess with it on 4. I'm going to try to change 4. So I'm going to go into edit screen and I'm going to inspect element. Boop. And I am going to somewhere in here find where's that hidden? Where's the hidden? Oh, input type hidden. Right. So that is the input type equals hidden. No, that's the middleware token. That's not the one I want to change. Oh, this is gonna, where's the, I would think that. Oh, it's because it's in this URL. I don't think if I change this to 4, it's actually going to work. But let's try it. It's probably not going to work. Yeah, that one worked. Okay, but the idea is eventually someone could mess with that post, so you still got to protect it. Right when that data is being modified, it actually does, it runs this code again, and it reads the thing, and if it can't read it, then it won't let you update it. And so that protects you from people breaking in and attacking there. And the owner delete view is the same thing. So if you go into delete, it does a get query set, and I add this filter to say, and it has to belong to the right person. So if I try to delete article 4, boom, it says I can't load article 4. But if I come over here, and I've got to log back in. So this one I think was CSEV. I think. Yeah, so now I can't delete number, but I can delete number 4 here because it kind of hides it, which is crappy, but there it is. It's deleting number 4, and away I go. So, okay, a lot of stuff. Okay, so here's the thing. We're going to use owner.py over and over and over again. We're going to write simple and elegant views, and all we have to do, ultimately, any model that we want to have this owner feature with, we add an owner column to it, then we have the views extend an owner view, and then everything's taken care of after that point. So it's really, we're not going to change a line of this. It's really cool. We're going to use it in project after project, on table after table after table, right? Because this can apply to different models. It's just this one happens to be applying to an article model. So I've built a super generic owner capability that I can use over and over. And just take your time, watch this more than once, review object orientation, figure this out. It's hard for me when I'm teaching to explain why object orientation is cool. Object orientation is cool because it can let you write these super elegant and very reliable. The fewer lines of code you write, the more reliable it is. But the harder it is to understand because the magic is here in this object-oriented pattern. And again, it took me a long time to write this stuff, but now it's really gorgeous and really reusable. So keep thinking about object orientation. We're going to be doing a lot going forward in terms of object orientation. Okay? So I hope this helps. Cheers. Hello and welcome to another screen recording for Django for Everybody. In this one, we're going to play with the Bootstrap menu. So what's a Bootstrap menu? A Bootstrap menu is a common bit that's going to be on a whole different set of pages. And so in this particular menu, we're going to have like a page 1, a page 2, a page 3 inside of a drop-down, and then we have kind of like a login drop-down. I'm already logged in, I'll log out, and then it switches when I'm logged in. When I'm logged in, it shows my gravatar. When I want to log in, I'll log in as CSEV, DJ42 exclamation. Ooh, come on. Actually, I think let's call this DJ free. I think will work. Yeah, and so that shows a little picture based on your email address. And so I'll show you how all these things work. But again, we're talking multiple pages. Now, the couple things you'll see is we are changing the highlight of this. And so if I was to do a view source, these are completely different pages. And what you see is on the highlighted one, where was I? Page 2 is the highlighted one. I have a list tag for page 1, and then a list tag class equals active for page 2, and that's what makes this highlighted. So these are different pages. So in this menu, we have to know what current page we're on, so we can look at the request path. It's page 2, so we know to put active on the page 2 one. So there'll be some logic inside this navigation bar. So let's take a look at some of the code. So I'm really going to do this all in templates. So you see I'm using template view in the urls.py, and I just have I got 3 pages that are all going to render the menu, menu/main menu HTML. And so there's nothing in the views of any importance. It's because I just got template view that I'm using. So let's take a quick look at the actual menu. So it's really quite simple, because one of the things you're going to do is you're going to have these pages and lots of them. So you don't want all of this HTML that's needed for this header sitting in every one of the pages. So we will use the extends mechanism in a template to say, oh, let's go and grab base menu.html and start with that. So we've been working with base Bootstrap, and Bootstrap uses all kinds of pages, but it doesn't have a menu, and it has areas that you can replace. So we've been working with base Bootstrap for a while, but now we want to do the menu. So what we're going to see is, instead of extending base Bootstrap, we're going to extend base menu, and that's our own local file. So you'll note that base menu extends base Bootstrap, and this is the same base Bootstrap we've been using all along. And what it basically does, this app tags, we'll talk about that in a second. That's how the Gravatar works. It is going to override this nav bar block, and you'll see that this goes all the way down. That's on just one big nav tag. And so the nav bar comes in right here, right after we say div class equals container. And then we have this welcome, we have these flash messages, area for flash alerts. Those are the messages that say, congratulations, you added a file. Congratulations, you deleted a file. And then the block content, and then the end of this container div. So block content is what we're going to override here. And the block nav bar is what we're overriding in menu. So block nav bar is being overridden. So we have one template that extends another template that extends another template. And so we're, just like any kind of object-oriented, we're sort of specializing and further specializing and further specializing. So Bootstrap can be used with or without a menu, but then once we add the menu to base Bootstrap, then we have base menu. Okay? So this is the top part of the page, and every page simply extends base menu and then puts whatever content it is. It says, just, I would like a menu here. So let's take a look at the menu. So the first thing you do is you go, I'm using Bootstrap. So if you go read up on Bootstrap, it'll tell you this is how you make a menu. And it tells you how to use the nav tag and what classes to put on the nav tag, how the container works, and the header and the brand and all these little classes. I didn't make this up. This is what Bootstrap said. This is how Bootstrap makes it pretty and dark and curvy little things, and they all line up nice, etc., etc. So I had to read that, and so this pretty much is taken straight from some sample code, except for one little thing, and that is the mechanism by which I, on different pages, can highlight which page I'm on, which is a very common something you want to do in menus. And so we have a UL tag, and the UL tag is this list of things. And then you have an LI. And what we're doing here, this is a weird little bit of Django template language. We are causing the URL function to be called with a parameter of menu:\main to give us a path. So, boop, right? Menu colon main is slash menu. If you look at URLs, it's menu colon main is this view, and it's the path that's just slash menu. And so this is like an assignment statement in the Django template language, and it leaves the value in XYZ. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put an if statement in. And all these if statements have been multi-line, but you don't have to make a multi-line. That is an if statement. If request.getFullPath is equal to XYZ, the variable I just computed, then emit class equals active. Otherwise, emit nothing. So again, now if we take a look at the source code, we view the source of this, view the source of the menu, and we scroll down, we will see that the home has a class of active and the other ones do not have a class of active. And that's why home has this little extra dark box, just to give a little clue to our user that that's the one that we're working with. And so this little pattern is repeated over and over to see if we're on page 1, if we're on page 2, and then we do the construct the drop down, and the drop down is just, again, this comes straight from the bootstrap, right? And so we have the drop down, we have another URL, we have a little page 3 link here, and it shows up, and this is just the text to make a cool drop down. Okay, and that's just bootstrap. Now we have a list that is the left side of the nav bar, and now we're starting the right side of the nav bar, which is also an unnumbered list. So this is cool. So we basically have two versions. One is if the user is authenticated, and then else if the user is not authenticated. So if the user is not authenticated, let's go ahead and log out here. If the user is not authenticated, we are just going to calculate a URL to the login page, which is /account/login. Let's pass a next to say come back here, right? Now, come back to the main menu. So if you go to login, it will say next equals, and it's come back here, right? And so that you construct that and you pass that login in. So I can do DJ free and I can log in and it will come back to the main menu, even though I clicked on it over here. Okay, but now we're in this page, and in this case, user.isAuthenticated is true. So we're going to construct a drop down. And this shows the drop down and takes the drop down out. And we're going to, in the drop down, we're going to say log out. But in the page, right, so this is the drop down menu. So that's the menu within the drop down that we turn on and off with a caret. But here's the gravatar. So this is an image tag, source equals, and then we have, oops, undo that. Then we have a double curly brace user piped through gravatar with a size of 60 pixel gravatar. Okay, so that is making this little image. So if we do it, let's do a quick inspect on that image. Inspect, okay, let's just do view source. This image is www.gravatar.com avatar / this long thing, okay? And if you go read on Avatar, Gravatar is a service. It's actually a Google service that you register your email, and this here is a hash of your email, and then that looks up and then gives you back this little URL. So if I was to take this URL right here, oh, don't do that, just, that's what I want. I take this URL, and I put it https:// it shows a little tiny picture of me, right? It shows a little tiny picture of me. But the question is, how did this get generated? It got generated by passing the user object, which is the same as user.isAuthenticated, except I'm piping it through a tag that I invented called gravatar. And again, this is code that is going to run just kind of like this URL code or whatever these things are, right? So what we have is we have a thing where we've loaded these app tags, okay? And so app tags are tags that we as developers can create. and then we can do things in it. So here's what's in app tags. So this is how you make a gravatar. You take the user's email, you strip it, throw away any white space, you convert it to lowercase, you encode it in UTF-8, and then you use the MD5, which is a hashing function, and make a hex digest. And that hex digest, this is an MD5, this long ugly string 2D0A2F51, that is a one-way hash of the email address. And if you go put that in to a thing, then if you know it, so that you can't figure out a person's email address from their gravatar, but you can from an email address figure out what the gravatar is. So this is not actually revealing the person's email address. So that's why we're using a one-way hash, an MD5 of the email address. And then I just construct the URL, put the hash in the right place, put the size, that 60 parameter. If you take a look, where are we at? This :60 is the second parameter to this code we wrote, so that 60 is size. So that's why it says 60 right there, S equals 60 right there. And then I'm going to, use the format. I'm going to use format, and I'll put the hash in and the size in, and return that as a string, and that goes all the way back here, and then replaces this double curly brace. So all those double curly braces and piping, that's just code somebody wrote. And in this case, the gravatar code is code that I wrote, and we wrote, or you could write, and that produces this URL. So it's a convenient way to put that URL in there, and it's really pretty, and it works out very cool. So you write this code, and it's in home, template tags, app tags.py, and then you basically have to load it in your menu. Where are we at? You have to go get app tags, and away you go. So that sums up how you can make a nice bootstrap menu and put it on your page through an extension menu, an extension mechanism. So we're going to extend it, and then boom, you make a page. Then you extend it again, and that puts it on the next page. So it's pretty easy. It's pretty straightforward. There's a lot of HTML, but luckily I hand that to you in the DJ free samples, and you're not going to have to modify that. It'll pretty much just work. You'll change what's in the menu. You'll be like putting different things in as the links and stuff. So you'll be working with this, but in general, most of the hard work is done. And as always, you can take a look at DJ free samples, just like we always do for inspiration. So I hope you found this helpful. Cheers.
So now we're in the second half of our data modeling exploration. We've talked about one-to-many, and now we're going to talk about many-to-many. Just to remember, we are in the bowels of a Django application, and we're really very much talking about the model.py file and how we mess with that. We're talking a little bit about the shell and how we can sort of look at the model.py and store stuff in the database, how we can like migrate, make migrations and update the database, and then read and write data from the database through the models. And so this, we're sort of narrowing in. Eventually we're going to see all the rest of the Django application, the views, the forms, the templates. And we've done a little bit with routing and a little bit with admin, but just remember that we're going to look at each of these pieces in turn and eventually make some sense out of them. So in this data model, which I think is a really cool data model because it shows two one-to-many relationships and two many-to-many relationships. One very simple and one a little bit more complex. Both the genre and the author are example of one-to-many. And just sort of foreshadowing, see the one ... asterisk there on both ends of the links? Well, that basically says one or more, up to an infinite. The other one's 0 ... the line's kind of covering it. 0 or more and 1 or more. So the one-to-many has 1 on one side. Sometimes it has 0 on or 1, but 1 on one side and then 0 ... star or 1 ... star. So many-to-many is a different kind of creature. So remember how in the last modeling exercise, you'll notice I showed you genre and author, and then I kind of stopped talking about them. I only talked about language and book instance. So in this one, we're going to talk about genre and author, and that's because genre and author are kind of problematic, because really each book can have multiple authors, and each book can be multiple genres. And so in that previous lecture, I kept these really simple. And you see this syntax here where I'm just kind of making a spreadsheet, or another way to be thinking about it would be a single wide table with all my data in one table, but I'm starting to put commas in. And so when you have commas, in a user interface, you think of this as perhaps a multi-select, where you have a list of things and you can highlight more than one of those things. And so anytime you sort of see this pattern, it's another form of replication, and that is that the Raspberry Pi book can be of the tech genre and the kids genre, and the Wizards Stay Up Late book can be of the tech genre and the thinking genre, right? Some books have one genre, some books have two genres, some books have one author, some have two, but then the problem is they might have 10 authors or 20 authors. And so how do we represent these things? And if you're sort of looking at either a UI or sort of a UI or just kind of a flat data table, you start seeing these commas. And as soon as you see the commas, you think to yourself, that is an indicator that this might be a many-to-many relationship. So if this were a one-to-many, not one-to-one, this was a one-to-many. If this was a one-to-many relationship, sort of like what we did with languages, we would have a book, and that would have a genre foreign key in it that would point to a row in a genre table. And that would make some sense, right? But that doesn't make sense because we have to have genres more than one. And you could basically decide for your application developers that you can't have more than one genre. But the application developers would say, sorry, we're librarians, and we know that there's more than one genre, so you, the programmer, have got to come up with a data model that represents that. And so if this was a one-to-many, you could have like a genre ID, and each book would be able to pick a row out of the genre, and so they would sort of mark themselves. Now, this is another moment where it's a warning sign. And you're like, well, maybe we would just have two foreign keys, and how about books are only allowed to have two genres, you know? Maybe one's not enough, but two's enough. Let's make it three. And so, and people who are doing data modeling early in their career, they'll be like, yeah, I'll just make a genre ID 01, genre ID 02, and then later like genre ID 03, and away you go. And this is completely wrong. Because genres, of course, is a weird example, but if it's authors, there are plenty of books with 8 or 9, 10, 11 authors, right? And so this, when you see yourself thinking this in your head, that like, oh, I'll just add an array of things here. No. And it has to do with it violates the basic notion of relations and connections and how you model stuff to the extent that you can with connections. And so that leads us to what's called the many-to-many. And so the many-to-many is a situation where you have sort of somewhere between one infinity and somewhere between one infinity on both sides. Now, what we need to do to model this is we can't really model many-to-many in a relational database. So what we do is we break it into two one-to-manys, and we have a junction table. You could call this the author book table. Later I'll call this the authored table, like, you know, who are the authors of? You could call it authors of. And it's a table that's a very short table, and it really just says, this author authored this book, this author authored this book, this author authored this book. And then within that, you can say for this book, who are all the authors, or for this author, what are all the books, right? So we call it a connection table, we call it a join table, we call it a junction table, and in Django terminology, we'll call this a through table. But its purpose is to have two outbound one-to-many relationships instead, and that basically is just our way of capturing a one-to-many. And that's why I said one-to-many plus one-to-many equals many-to-many. 2-to-many would be sound good, but many-to-many. So here we are, and here are our two many-to-many relationships in our local library application. So a book can have many authors, and an author can have many books, and that's what we're characterizing with this little 1 dot dot star, 1 dot dot star. And the same is true, like a genre can have be associated with many books. And interestingly, the 0 dot dot star, that's special, where the book connects to genre and it's 0 dot dot star coming out of the book. That means it's a minimum of 0. And all that's really capturing is that a book can have no genres, but a book must have at least one author. And whether that's true or not, that's what this data model is saying. This data model is saying all books have at least one author, but they have 0 or more genres, but they have 1 or more authors. And that's the subtle difference between 0 dot dot star and 1 dot dot star. And that's the kind of clever little application features that these applications can, these data models can capture beautifully. And we'll see in a second how that turns into a Django model that is then a business rule for the data. And so this is how it works. We're going to create two tables, the book table and the author table, and every row is going to have an ID, auto increment, primary key column. And then we're going to have these outbound foreign keys from authored. Again, the authored table is the start of the arrow, so it's the one that has the foreign key column in it, and the destination of the arrow is a primary key in that other table. Now, what we're going to do is, and we'll see how this works, is that Django allows us to create these kind of virtual attributes, and we'll name them cleverly. The name of them doesn't matter, but we'll basically say inside of author, we're going to have an attribute of books, which is automatically going to be populated by all the books the author wrote. And in book, there'll be this little virtual thing. It's actually computed. It's not stored. It's actually computed based on reading the authored table. It'll be authors, which is a list of all the authors. And so this is a convenient way, because in Django, they kind of want to hide this middle table. It exists. And as a matter of fact, you can write, drop my pen. Drop my pen. Pick the pen back up. Make sure the audio is still working. Is the audio still working? Yeah, it is. Audio's still working. Life's good. Sorry about that slight interruption. So Django tends to want to hide this through table, and you can actually define models where you don't even give that a name and it makes one up. It still exists. It exists exactly like it's shown here, but I would rather in my data model show you this table so you have a better understanding. But if you see other data models where they don't explicitly mention this and just have a many-to-many, and it actually makes this table up for you. So don't get all freaked out if you see a model that doesn't have the through table explicitly modeled. I like to do it. So here we go. So here we have some models. So we have the book field. The title is just a bit of the book. Then authors is a many-to-many field going toward the author table. That's the far one. But the through table is authored. So the intermediate table, the junction table, the through table is the authored table. The author is on the other side. The author has a name, and it has books, which is this kind of virtual set in there that's a many-to-many field derived pointing at the book table with a through table of authored. So the junction table, we mentioned the junction table the same in both of these, right? So this is going, from one to the other, and this is kind of going back. And these are like virtual, it's not data that's stored in the each row of the book table. It is data which is derived for you if you ask for it. When you retrieve a book, you can say, what are the authors of this book? It's a convenience in a way. And it also is telling Django about the foreign keys and where to store the foreign keys, and the fact that it's a many-to-many field. That's all setting up this stuff so that Django, when you start putting stuff in these tables, Django automatically puts the right stuff into those tables. And like I said, here's the through table I called authored. I thought that was kind of clever. And the through table is modeled as foreign key this way, foreign key that way. And so that's not a many-to-many. It's a foreign key, but I've named these and I match these things up. Now, the on-delete cascade is the same as the other one. These are now these are two one-to-manys, right? The through table has a one-to-many going this way and a one-to-many going that way. And on delete cascade, and so just the whole idea of a book author combination is if the authors are deleted, if you delete an author, you want to delete all the entries in the authored table that correspond to that author. If we do delete a book, you want to delete automatically all the entries in that. And so that's what on delete cascade means in the authored table, and that's clean this table up if things are deleted but from the outside two tables. So that automatic cleanup is done for us, which is quite nice, and we just request that with this on delete statement. So I don't know, that's a beautiful thing. That is a beautiful thing. It's so pure and so simple. And I don't like it when you don't put the authored table in there, because you can sort of do this and then it'll make the authored table up, but then there's certain things that don't work as well, and I don't like that. Okay, so let's just say we created this models.py file. Of course, in DJ4E samples, if you checked it out and you ran make migrations, it makes them all. But let's just say this is the first time you'd run make migrations, and then you'd see that it's creating the migrations, and then you do the migrate, which of course, as we talked about in the previous lecture, that is what takes from the migrations and then updates the database. And both the make migrations and the migrate are checking to see which ones have already been done. So make migrations is looking for changes or deltas in the models.py file, and the migrate is looking for deltas in the migrations. And again, remember that the list of the things that both of these is looking at is based on the settings.py file, and it's the installed apps variable in the settings.py file. So I put this note in because students are always saying, my make migrations didn't do anything. Well, there's one of two reasons. It either is not in the settings.py file, or it's already done. So I don't know which of those it is, but those are the two things to look for. If you think you're running a make migrations and it's not running, it either already ran, which is fine, that's totally fine, or you forgot to add it to settings.py. So, okay. So here's just a few things that we can do in the shell, right? Again, Python 3 manage py shell. You got to run this from the folder that has manage.py in it, which is the project folder. Projects have many applications. And so because the manage.py shell starts up and preloads, again, the manage.py shell reads all of the apps that are in settings.py, loads their models, and a few other things from those, preloads them. And so that's why bookmany.models exists at the very first line here, because Django, in a sense, has woke up and preloaded all of the classes and things that are there. So it's in a Django application, not just in a Python shell. So we import bookmany as the name of the application, and the models are book, author, and authored. So some of this hopefully is starting to look familiar to you. We create an object of type book model. The title's networking, and then we save it. Remember, save is the thing that transmits the in-memory object into the database and populates that ID field. And when you start linking these together, populating the ID field is very important. We do a Raspberry Pi book and we save that. And now we're going to make an author for Kristen and save that, and an author for me, and we save that. And so at this point we have made two authors and we've made two books, but now we have to connect them together, okay? And so what we're going to basically say is we're going to create an authored record, a record in author, with a book B, connecting book B1 with author A2 and save it. Then book B2 connected with author A1 and save that. Book B2 connected with author A1 and save that. So that's throwing 3 records into the authored table, making those connections, setting the foreign keys. So like it's just reading the ID field from these A1, A2, and B1, B2, and that's like inserting records into the author table in the book underscore ID and the author underscore ID, right? Now, remember that in book we have this virtual set called authors, and in author we have this virtual set called books. Again, that's not actually stored in the book table or the books table. It is generated by reading through the appropriate things in the author table. That's how it's generated. So, if we say for book 1, .authors, this is like that little virtual thing, and it reads all of the corresponding authors from the authored table, and then values just says actually go retrieve them. And so now we see that the authors for book 1 is a list of just one author named Severance. Book 2, authors values, is a list with Kristen and me. And then author 1, who's that? Author 1 is Kristen. What books did she write? Well, she wrote the Raspberry Pi book. We co-wrote that book. And then author 2, what books did he write? Well, he wrote the networking book by himself, and he's a co-author with Kristen on this other book. And there's all kind of other things that you can do, but you kind of get this idea that you don't have to do too much with the authored table, but and then once you got things all set up, you can sort of like walk the authored table without actually knowing it, because we preset these things when we made the data model and said what the through table was. And so the through table is sort of a magic thing that's useful, but we don't really explicitly deal with it too much. Now up next, I'm going to show you a different example of many-to-many, just to sort of bring this home a bit. So now I want to show you another example of many-to-many from an application that's near and dear to my heart, and that's the auto grader that I use for most of my online classes. So one of the things the auto grader has to know is like who is in what course, so that we can track grades based on people in courses. And so this is the data model, and it's a little bit different syntax. You sort of see one-to-many. It's using this what's called crow's feet. And you see this little crow foot, and that's like a many when it sort of spreads out. And then you sort of have this one, and there's various little ways, and one or more or zero or more. And so there's that's called a crow's foot diagram. But these diagrams ultimately are capturing the same thing, whether these relationships are many-to-many or one-to-many, and what the cardinality of each end of the relationship is. And this is showing a person table, a course table, and a membership table, and this is a very common thing that we have to solve in educational systems. And it's a little bit more sophisticated than the previous one, which I thought was beautifully elegant and simple, but I want to show you this one as well. And so what we have here is basically people are in courses, right? A person can be in many courses, and a course can have many people, so it's a many-to-many relationship. We create a through table, we'll call it a member table. We end up, just like before, with two one-to-manys pointing out, or many-to-ones pointing outward. So we have a person ID and a course ID in the member table. All three of these tables have primary keys of ID, ID, and ID. And then we put the little tiny sort of virtual set in here, so that at a person you can just look at a virtual set of their courses, and in a course you can say who are the members of this course. Now we're going to do one more thing that's a little bit different here, and that is often the simplest of through tables is literally an ID and two foreign keys. And as a matter of fact, some people, Django doesn't like doing this, but some people don't even include the ID field, and they just make the combination of the two foreign keys as a unique ID. And if you're doing databases directly, you can actually do that. But here's a thing that you can also do. So if you think about in a teaching and learning situation, people aren't just members of courses. They are members of courses, and they have a role. And is that role as a learner, a teaching assistant, or an instructor, or perhaps they're the departmental administrator, right? And that is an attribute of the connection, right? The connection between a person and a course is the membership, and oh, by the way, they're not just a member, they're a member with some metadata, okay? And so sometimes we add data to the through table, and it's actually quite useful, and it's really the only place to model this kind of data, because somebody might be in a course as a teacher, and they might be in a different course as a student, so you can't just say this person is always a teacher, or they're always a student. You can't say that. It depends on the context, and so that's why at the connection between a particular person and a particular course, we actually model the role that they have in that course. So here we go. So we're going to have a person in a course. And and we're going to have a through table of membership. And so we're going to send these things back and forth to each other. And this membership is the tricky one. And so we have a foreign